The hammering on the door came before dawn, hard enough to rattle the thin glass of the shop window. Elena Marsh sat up on the narrow cot behind the counter, her heart slamming against her ribs. She had fallen asleep there again, surrounded by bolts of cloth and half-finished dresses, because the workroom was warmer than the small flat above where her mother lay coughing through the night. She grabbed a shawl and hurried to the door, already knowing, somehow, that nothing good waited on the other side of it. Two men stood in the gray morning light. One held a folded paper stamped with a wax seal she did not recognize. The other, taller and silent, simply looked past her into the shop, as though he were already counting what could be taken from it. "Miss Marsh," the man with the paper said, not unkindly, but without warmth either. "By order of the Ashworth estate, this property and its contents are to be seized in payment of outstanding debt. You have 3 days to vacate." Elena stared at him. For a moment the words did not make sense, as if he had spoken in another language. Then they landed all at once, and the cold morning air seemed to press into her chest. "There must be some mistake," she said. "This shop belonged to my father. Any debts were settled when he passed." "I'm afraid not, miss." The man consulted his paper again, though Elena suspected he already knew every word on it. "The debt was incurred against this property some years ago, and interest has accrued since. The full sum now owed is considerable. Duke Ashworth's estate has called it in." "Duke Ashworth," Elena repeated. She had heard the name spoken in the market, with a mixture of fear and resentment, the way people spoke of storms and bad harvests. She had never expected it to be spoken at her own door. "I don't understand. I've never done business with any duke." "The debt is not yours, miss. It was your father's, from a loan he took against the property. It appears he never repaid it before he died. The estate has simply waited, as was its right, and now the note has come due in full." The man's eyes flicked, briefly, with something like pity. "I am sorry. 3 days." They left her standing in the doorway with the paper in her hands, the wax seal bearing a crest she would come to know far too well in the months ahead. A hawk, with its wings spread, clutching an olive branch in one talon and a sword in the other. Elena went back inside slowly, as if walking through water. Behind the curtain that separated the shop from the tiny room where her mother rested, she could hear the shallow, rattling breaths that had frightened her for weeks now. Her younger brother, Peter, only 14, was already awake, sitting on the edge of his cot with wide eyes. "Who was that?" he asked. Elena folded the paper carefully, as though handling it gently might soften what it said. "Someone who thinks we owe him a great deal of money," she said. "I need to find out if that's true." It took her the better part of that first day to piece together the truth, moving between the town records office and the small firm of solicitors her father had once used. What she learned made her stomach twist with a mixture of grief and fury. Her father, in the last hard years of his life, had borrowed against the shop to pay for her mother's medicine and to keep food on the table during a winter when work had been scarce. He had borrowed not from a bank, but from a private lender connected to the Ashworth estate, at terms that seemed, even to Elena's untrained eye, deliberately punishing. He had died before repaying more than a fraction of it, and in the years since, the debt had grown like a weed left untended, doubling and doubling again. "There is nothing to be done," the solicitor told her, not meeting her eyes. "The Ashworth estate is not an institution one negotiates with easily. The Duke's man of business is thorough, and the Duke himself is," he hesitated, choosing his words, "exacting." "Then I will speak to him myself," Elena said. The solicitor looked at her, as though she had suggested walking into a lion's den wearing a necklace of meat. "I would advise against that, Miss Marsh." But Elena had never been the sort of person to sit quietly while her family's future was decided by strangers. The next morning, she dressed in her best clothes, the ones she usually saved for church, and walked the 3 miles to Ashworth Manor, with the folded paper clutched in her hand like a weapon. The manor rose out of the morning mist like something from an old story, all gray stone and tall windows, iron gates, guarded by a man who looked at her threadbare coat with open suspicion. It took nearly an hour of insistence, and finally a small bribe of the coins she could not afford to lose, before she was allowed past the gate and into a cold marble entrance hall to wait. She waited so long her feet went numb in her worn boots. She waited long enough to notice the portraits on the walls, generations of Ashworths staring down at her with the same proud, unreadable expression. as if the family had been bred for haughtiness, the way farmers bred horses for speed. When the tall double doors finally opened, it was not a steward who emerged, but the Duke himself. Elena had expected an older man, gray and stooped, the sort of villain she had imagined while walking the long road to the manor. Instead, Sebastian Ashworth was younger than she had pictured, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothes that fit him with the precision of someone who had never known want. His face was handsome in a severe way, all sharp lines and cold, assessing eyes, the kind of face that seemed built for judgment rather than kindness. He looked at her the way one might look at an unexpected stain on a clean floor. "You are the seamstress," he said. It was not a question. "Elena Marsh," she said, lifting her chin. "My family's shop is being seized for a debt I only learned of yesterday. I have come to ask for time. My mother is ill. My brother is still a boy. We have nowhere else to go." "Debts do not wait for convenient timing, Miss Marsh." His voice was low and even, without a trace of sympathy. "Your father borrowed money he could not repay. The estate extended him considerable patience while he lived. That patience does not extend indefinitely to his heirs. We are not asking for the debt to vanish," Elena said, forcing her voice to stay steady, though her hands were shaking. "Only for time. A payment plan. Anything." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes, though Elena could not have said what. Calculation, perhaps, or simple boredom, with a conversation he considered already finished. "There is another option," he said finally. "My household is in need of additional staff. My previous companion to my aunt has recently left her post, and I find myself short of capable hands, who can also manage correspondence and finer needlework for the household. You will work here, in service, until the debt is considered paid. Room and board will be provided. Your family's shop will remain untouched during that time, though it will not be returned to you outright until the term is complete." Elena's pride screamed at her to refuse, to tell this cold, arrogant man exactly what she thought of being reduced to a bargaining chip for her own survival. But she thought of her mother's rattling breath, of Peter's frightened eyes, of the shop that held every memory she had of her father, and she swallowed the refusal whole. "For how long?" she asked. "1 year," the Duke said. "Perhaps less, if your work proves valuable enough. Perhaps more, if it does not." It was not a fair offer. It was not even really an offer at all, not when the alternative was watching her family lose everything. But Elena had learned, in the hard years since her father's death, that fairness was a luxury the poor rarely got to demand. "I accept," she said. Something like satisfaction flickered across the Duke's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Good. You will begin in 3 days' time, once your affairs are settled. Do not be late." He turned to leave, already dismissing her from his mind, it seemed, before he had even left the room. But Elena found her voice one more time. "Your Grace," she said, testing the title, feeling how strange and heavy it sat on her tongue. "May I ask why you are doing this? You could have simply taken the shop and left us to fend for ourselves. It would have been easier." The Duke paused at the door, his back to her. For a moment, Elena thought he would not answer at all. "Easier," he said quietly, "is not always necessary." And then he was gone, leaving her standing alone in the vast, echoing hall, wondering exactly what kind of arrangement she had just agreed to. The 3 days before she was to report to the manor passed in a blur of packing, arranging for a neighbor to check on her mother and Peter, and steeling herself for what was to come. Her mother wept when she heard the news, blaming herself, blaming Elena's father, blaming the unfairness of a world where the poor could be swallowed whole by the debts of the dead. Peter said little, but Elena caught him staring at the crest on the paper for a long time, memorizing the hawk with its sword and olive branch, as if fixing an enemy's face in his mind. On the morning she was to leave, Elena stood in the doorway of the shop one last time, running her hand along the counter where her father had once measured cloth with such careful, patient hands. She thought of all the versions of her life that might have been, if he had never needed to borrow that money, if her mother had never fallen ill, if fate had simply been a little kinder. But wishing changed nothing. She picked up her small bag, kissed her mother's forehead, promised Peter she would visit when she could, and walked the long road to Ashworth Manor, with her spine straight and her jaw set. determined that whatever the Duke demanded of her in service, he would never once see her broken. She arrived at the servants' entrance just as the sun was beginning to set, the manor's windows glowing gold against the darkening sky. A stern-looking housekeeper named Mrs. Bellamy met her at the door, looking her up and down with the practiced eye of someone who had trained dozens of girls before her. "You're the seamstress the Duke mentioned," Mrs. Bellamy said. "Elena Marsh?" "Yes, ma'am." "Well then, come in out of the cold. There's a great deal you'll need to learn, and quickly. His Grace does not tolerate slow learners." Mrs. Bellamy's expression softened, just slightly, as she looked at Elena's tired face. "For what it's worth, girl, you'll find the work honest, even if the master is difficult. Keep your head down, do your duties well, and the year will pass." Elena nodded, though privately she doubted anything about the coming year would be simple. As she followed Mrs. Bellamy through the servants' corridors, past kitchens filled with the smell of roasting meat, and hallways lined with more portraits of stern-faced Ashworths, she felt the weight of what she had agreed to settle fully onto her shoulders for the first time. She had traded her freedom, if only temporarily, for her family's survival. She had bowed to a man whose coldness had already unsettled something deep in her chest, though she could not yet name what that feeling was. Anger, certainly. But underneath the anger, something else stirred too, something she refused to look at too closely. That night, lying on the narrow bed in the small servants' room she had been assigned, Elena stared up at the ceiling and made herself a quiet promise. She would work. She would endure. She would pay off her family's debt and leave this cold, gilded house without ever once giving Duke Sebastian Ashworth the satisfaction of seeing her spirit broken. Whatever he demanded of her in the year ahead, she decided, he would never truly have her respect, not unless he earned it. And looking at the hard lines of his face, the careless cruelty with which he had spoken of her family's suffering, Elena could not imagine that day ever coming. She closed her eyes, exhausted, and let sleep pull her under, unaware that just down the hall, in his own grand and lonely chambers, the Duke lay awake as well, turning over in his mind the unusual defiance he had seen flash in the eyes of the seamstress from town, and wondering, despite himself, why he could not quite stop thinking about it. Elena woke before the sun the next morning, out of old habit, the years of rising early, to open her father's shop too deeply worn into her, to shake off in a single night. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The unfamiliar ceiling, the smell of beeswax polish instead of her mother's cooking, the silence of a house so large it seemed to swallow sound itself, all of it reminded her sharply of everything she had left behind. A soft knock came at her door before she had even finished dressing. A young maid, perhaps a year or two younger than Elena, peered in with a friendly, curious face. "You must be the new one," the maid said. "I'm Charlotte. Mrs. Bellamy sent me to show you where everything is, before His Grace expects you in the East study." Elena thanked her, grateful for a single warm face in a house that had so far shown her mostly cold stone and colder stairs. Charlotte led her through a maze of corridors, chattering easily about the household as they walked, filling in details Elena had not thought to ask about. The Duke, Charlotte explained in a lowered voice, had not always been so severe. Servants who had been with the family longer sometimes spoke of a different man before his father's death, someone who had laughed more easily and walked the grounds with less weight on his shoulders. Whatever had happened since then, Charlotte said, had hardened him into someone few in the household dared to cross. "He's fair, though," Charlotte added quickly, as if worried she had said too much. "Strict, but fair. He doesn't punish without cause, not like some masters do. Just don't expect warmth. I don't think he has much of that left to give." Elena filed the words away carefully, unsure yet what to make of them. It was easier, in some ways, to think of the Duke as simply cruel, a villain from an old tale, who took pleasure in the suffering of those beneath him. A man who was merely hardened by grief was harder to hate cleanly, and hating him cleanly was the only thing keeping her spine straight in this unfamiliar place. By the time she reached the East study, the sun had fully risen, spilling gold light across a room lined floor to ceiling, with books, a massive oak desk, positioned near the tall windows overlooking the grounds. The Duke was already there, reviewing papers with the same severe concentration she imagined he brought to everything, still dressed as impeccably as he had been 2 days before, as though rumpled clothing were simply not permitted to exist in his presence. He did not look up when she entered. "You are late," he said. "I was told to arrive at first light, Your Grace," Elena replied, forcing calm into her voice, despite the injustice of the accusation. "The sun has only just risen." "Then you should have arrived before it did." He finally lifted his eyes to hers, and for a moment, Elena thought she saw the faintest flicker of amusement buried beneath his stern expression. Though it vanished so quickly, she could not be certain it had been there at all. "There is correspondence to be sorted, and a torn hem on my sister's traveling coat that requires mending before she departs this afternoon. Mrs. Bellamy will show you where the supplies are kept. I expect competence, Miss Marsh, not excuses." "You will have it," Elena said, and meant it, though the words came out sharper than she intended. The Duke's eyebrow lifted slightly at her tone, and this time, Elena was certain she had not imagined the flicker of interest in his expression. Gone again, almost as soon as it appeared. "See that I do," he said, and returned his attention to his papers, dismissing her as completely as he had 2 days before. Elena left the study, with her jaw tight, and her hands curled into fists at her sides, though she was careful to keep her steps calm and even, until she was well out of his sight. It would be a long year, she thought, if every exchange between them carried this same current of quiet battle beneath the surface. But as she made her way toward the sewing room to begin her first day of work, she found herself oddly steadied by the challenge of it, as though some stubborn part of her welcomed the fight rather than fearing it. Whatever Duke Sebastian Ashworth expected from her, she decided, he would find her far harder to break than he imagined. The days at Ashworth Manor fell into a rhythm faster than Elena expected, though it was not a gentle one. She rose before dawn, worked through mending, correspondence, and whatever tasks Mrs. Bellamy assigned her, and fell into bed each night, with fingers pricked from needles and a mind exhausted from the constant effort of holding herself together in front of people who seemed to expect her to crumble. The Duke, she quickly learned, demanded formality in all things. On her third day, he called her into the study to review letters she had copied for him, and though her penmanship was neat and every word correct, he found fault with the way she had addressed him, in a note left for the housekeeper. "You wrote the Duke requests rather than my name properly given," he said, tapping the paper with one finger. "That is acceptable in formal correspondence, but when you speak to me directly, Miss Marsh, you will address me as Your Grace. Not Sir. Not any informal substitute you might imagine suits the moment, Your Grace. Is that understood?" Elena stood very still, feeling something tighten in her chest at the demand, though she could not have said exactly why it struck her so deeply. Perhaps it was simply one indignity too many, piled atop the loss of her father's shop, the ache of missing her mother and brother, the constant awareness of her own reduced circumstances in this house of marble and gold. "Understood, Your Grace," she said, the title coming out clipped and cold. He studied her for a long moment, as though registering something in her tone he had not expected. "Good," he said finally, and returned to his papers. That night, lying awake in her small room, Elena turned the moment over and over in her mind. It was such a small thing, in the end, a title, a few syllables of respect that cost her nothing to give, and yet something in her rebelled against it fiercely, some stubborn core of pride that refused to let this man, who had taken her family's shop and reduced her to servitude over a debt she had not even incurred, hear warmth or true deference in her voice. She made a decision that night, quiet and private, that she did not share with anyone in the household. She would call him Your Grace when duty demanded it, when refusing outright might cost her position and endanger her family's fragile arrangement. But whenever she could avoid it, whenever a sentence could be constructed without directly addressing him at all, she would use it. She would speak of him in the third person, even when speaking to his face, referring to the Duke, rather than looking him in the eye, and calling him anything at all. It was a small rebellion, invisible to anyone who was not paying close attention, but it was hers, and in a life where so much had been taken from her, having even this small thing, that belonged only to her, felt like something worth holding on to. The next morning, she tested her resolve for the first time. The Duke summoned her to discuss a stack of correspondence that needed sorting before an important gathering of estate matters later that week. "Miss Marsh," he said as she entered, "these letters need to be organized by matter before the end of the day. Can this be done?" "The task will be finished by evening," Elena replied, keeping her eyes on the papers rather than his face, her sentence carefully constructed to avoid any direct address. The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly, though he said nothing at first, simply watching her as she gathered the letters into a neat stack. It was only as she turned to leave that he spoke again. "You did not address me," he said. Elena paused at the door, her heart hammering, though her face remained carefully neutral. "I answered your question, Your Grace," she said, the title finally offered, though it cost her something to say it even then. "You avoided it until the very end," he said, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before, a note of genuine curiosity beneath the usual coldness. "Most in this household fall over themselves to use the title as often as possible. You seem determined to use it as little as you can manage." Elena's chin lifted, and for a moment her careful composure slipped, revealing the anger she had been holding beneath it. "Forgive me, Your Grace, if I do not share their enthusiasm for reminding myself, every few sentences, of exactly how little power I hold in this house." The words hung in the air between them, sharper than she had intended, and Elena immediately regretted the honesty of them, certain she had just ended whatever fragile peace existed between herself and the man who controlled her family's future. But the Duke did not respond with anger. Instead, something almost like respect flickered across his face, quickly hidden, but not quickly enough for Elena to miss entirely. "You may go, Miss Marsh," he said quietly, and Elena fled the room before he could see how much her hands were shaking. Word of the small exchange did not spread through the household, as Elena had feared it might. Whatever passed between herself and the Duke in that study seemed to remain contained within those four walls, though Elena noticed, in the days that followed, a subtle shift in how he interacted with her. He began finding reasons to summon her more often than her duties strictly required, asking her opinion on matters of correspondence or household arrangement that he had never before troubled to ask any servant about. Each time, Elena answered carefully, constructing her sentences to avoid direct address whenever possible, watching with something like grim satisfaction as his expression flickered between irritation and something else entirely, something she did not yet have a name for. Mrs. Bellamy noticed the pattern before anyone else did. She cornered Elena in the linen room one afternoon, her sharp eyes assessing. "His Grace has summoned you to the study 4 times this week," the housekeeper said. "That is 4 more times than he summoned the last companion in an entire month." "I only answer when called, Mrs. Bellamy," Elena said carefully. "I have done nothing to invite his attention." "I did not say you had," Mrs. Bellamy replied, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. "Only that it is unusual. His Grace does not typically seek out conversation, with servants or otherwise. He has grown quite closed off since his father passed, and even more so since," she stopped herself, pressing her lips together as though she had nearly said too much. "Since what?" Elena asked, curiosity overriding caution. Mrs. Bellamy shook her head. "It is not my place to speak of the family's private matters. Just be careful, girl. Whatever is happening, tread carefully. His Grace's moods are not something to be trifled with, however interesting you might find them." Elena took the warning seriously, though she found it harder each day to keep the careful distance Mrs. Bellamy advised. There was something about the Duke that unsettled her in ways she did not fully understand, a coldness that seemed, the longer she observed it, less like natural cruelty, and more like armor worn so long it had become indistinguishable from skin. She caught him sometimes, in unguarded moments, staring out the tall windows of the study, with an expression of such deep, quiet grief, that it made her chest ache, despite everything he had done to her family. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into her service, Elena was sent to deliver a final set of correspondence to the study before the household retired for the night. She found the Duke standing before the fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, staring into the flames, with the same haunted expression she had glimpsed before. He did not seem to notice her enter at first, and Elena hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to announce herself or retreat quietly and return the letters in the morning. "You may enter, Miss Marsh," he said without turning, apparently having sensed her presence, despite his stillness. "I am not so lost in thought that I fail to notice an open door." Elena stepped inside, placing the letters on his desk with careful precision. "The correspondence for tomorrow's meeting, Your Grace," she said, offering the title this time without hesitation. something about the quiet vulnerability of the moment softening her usual resolve. He turned to look at her then, and for the first time since she had arrived at Ashworth Manor, Elena saw something other than cold authority in his eyes. She saw exhaustion. She saw grief, old and deep, and carefully hidden beneath layers of duty and formality. And beneath both of those things, she saw something that looked almost like loneliness, so profound it startled her. "Thank you," he said quietly, and the simplicity of the words, so different from his usual clipped commands, caught Elena off guard entirely. "Is something troubling you, Your Grace?" The question left her before she could stop it, born more of instinct than of any calculation about propriety or her place in the household. The Duke's expression shuddered immediately, the vulnerability she had glimpsed vanishing behind the familiar cold mask. "That is not a question a servant should ask her master," he said, though there was less bite in the words than she expected. "Forgive me," Elena said, though she did not entirely mean it. "I will take my leave, Your Grace." She turned to go, but his voice stopped her at the door. "Elena." She froze. It was the first time he had used her given name, rather than the formal address he insisted upon from her. The sound of it in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, one she immediately tried to suppress, reminding herself sharply of everything this man had taken from her family, of the year of servitude stretching out ahead of her like an endless road. "Your Grace?" she said, turning back to face him, careful to keep her own tone neutral despite the confusion churning inside her. For a moment, he simply looked at her, and Elena had the strange sense that he was as surprised by his own use of her name as she was. "Nothing," he said finally, his voice returning to its usual careful control. "You may go. Thank you for the correspondence." Elena left the study that night, with her mind racing, replaying the strange, brief moment of vulnerability she had witnessed, the sound of her own name in his voice, the loneliness she had glimpsed beneath his cold exterior, before he had shut it away again. She told herself it changed nothing, that whatever grief or loneliness drove the Duke's harsh manner did not excuse what he had done to her family, did not erase the year of servitude she still owed him. But that night, for the first time since arriving at Ashworth Manor, Elena found herself thinking about Sebastian Ashworth, not as a villain from a story, but as a man, complicated and wounded in ways she had not expected, and she was not entirely certain what to do with that realization, or with the way it had begun, however slightly, to soften the careful wall of anger she had built around her heart since the day the debt collectors first knocked on her father's shop door. The following morning brought a visitor to the manor, and with the visitor came a shift in the household's atmosphere that Elena felt before she even understood its cause. Carriages arrived early, wheels crunching over gravel, and the servants who had seemed merely brisk and efficient the day before now moved with a nervous, hurried energy that suggested something important was at stake. "Lady Priscilla," Charlotte whispered to Elena, as they hurried through the corridor with fresh linens. "His Grace's cousin. She visits often, though never for very long, and never without some scheme or another tucked up her sleeve." Elena caught only a glimpse of the visitor before being sent off to other duties, but the glimpse was enough to leave an impression. Lady Priscilla was beautiful in the practiced, polished way of women who had spent their entire lives being told beauty was their greatest asset, dressed in fabrics far finer than anything Elena had ever sewn, her dark hair arranged in elaborate curls that must have taken her maid hours to perfect. She moved through the manor as though she already owned it, greeting the staff with a cool, dismissive nod that made it clear she considered them barely worth noticing at all. Elena did her best to stay out of the visiting lady's path over the following days, focusing on her duties and trying not to dwell on the strange moment she had shared with the Duke in the study. But avoiding notice in a household as interconnected as Ashworth Manor proved more difficult than she expected. And on the third day of Lady Priscilla's visit, Elena found herself summoned to the drawing room to assist with alterations to a gown the lady wished to wear for an upcoming gathering. "You are the seamstress, working off her family's debt," Lady Priscilla said, as Elena knelt to pin the hem of the gown, her voice carrying the particular cruelty of someone who enjoyed reminding others of their lesser circumstances. "How very charitable of my cousin to offer you a position, rather than simply taking what was owed and turning you out to fend for yourself. His Grace has been generous, my lady," Elena said carefully, keeping her eyes on her work, refusing to give the woman the satisfaction of a reaction. Generous. Lady Priscilla laughed softly, the sound sharp as broken glass. That is not a word often used to describe Sebastian, I assure you. Careful, calculating, dutiful to a fault, certainly. But generous? She studied Elena with narrowed eyes, as though seeing something that troubled her. I do hope you are not mistaking his sense of duty for something warmer, girl. My cousin does not form attachments to those beneath his station. It would be beneath him, and beneath the memory of everything his family has built. Elena's hands stilled on the fabric for just a moment before she resumed her work, careful to keep her expression neutral, despite the sting of the words. I am here to work off a debt, my lady, nothing more. I have no illusions about my place in this household. See that you don't, Lady Priscilla said, though her tone suggested she remained unconvinced. It would be a shame, for such misunderstandings, to complicate an already difficult arrangement. The exchange left Elena unsettled, long after she had finished the alterations, and returned to her own duties. She told herself the lady's warning meant nothing, that there was no attachment forming between herself and the Duke worth warning against, that whatever strange, brief moments of vulnerability she had witnessed in him were simply the product of a lonely man's unguarded evening, nothing more. But the warning lingered anyway, a small thorn of doubt buried beneath her determination to survive the year ahead, with her pride intact. That evening, as she passed through the corridor, near the study, on an errand for Mrs. Bellamy, Elena overheard raised voices through the partially closed door. She recognized the Duke's low, controlled tones, and beneath them, Lady Priscilla's sharper, more urgent voice, though the words themselves were too muffled to make out clearly. She did not linger to listen, mindful of her place. But the tension in the exchange was unmistakable even from a distance, and Elena found herself wondering, as she hurried on toward her next task, exactly what business existed between the cousin and the Duke that could provoke such obvious discord. She would not have to wonder for long, but for now, exhausted from the long day and the weight of everything Lady Priscilla's words had stirred in her, Elena retreated to her small room and tried to push the entire matter from her mind, focusing instead on the letter she intended to write to her mother the following morning, filled with careful reassurances that everything at Ashworth Manor was, despite all evidence to the contrary, entirely under control. Lady Priscilla's visit stretched on for another week, and with each passing day, Elena felt the tension in the household grow thicker, like storm clouds gathering before a summer downpour. She kept her distance where she could, throwing herself into her duties, with a focus that left little room for dwelling on the strange currents running beneath the surface of Ashworth Manor. But avoiding notice entirely proved impossible, particularly once the Duke began, with increasing frequency, to seek her out for tasks that seemed to require far less skill than he claimed. These figures need checking before the quarterly accounts are finalized, he told her one morning, though Elena suspected, from the careful and unnecessary way he explained the simple columns of numbers, that the task was little more than an excuse to have her in the room a while longer. She had grown practiced, by then, at the small rebellion she had chosen for herself, constructing her sentences with careful precision to avoid direct address whenever possible, offering the required title only when duty absolutely demanded it. The Duke noticed, she was certain, though he no longer commented on it the way he had during their first weeks. Instead, he seemed to watch her with a kind of quiet, patient curiosity, as though observing an unusual specimen whose behavior he could not quite predict. The figures appear correct, Elena said, after reviewing the columns he had presented. There is a small error in the third entry, however. The sum has been carried incorrectly. The Duke leaned over to examine the page where she pointed, close enough that Elena caught the faint scent of cedar and leather that seemed to cling to him always. You have a sharp eye for numbers, he said, sounding almost surprised. Where did you learn such things? My father kept the shop's accounts himself, Elena said. He taught me from a young age, in case I ever needed to manage the books alone. She paused, then added, with more edge than she intended, which, as it turned out, I did, after his death, right up until they were taken from me entirely. The words hung in the air, sharper than she meant them to be, and Elena immediately regretted the bitterness in her tone, though she did not take the words back. The Duke's expression flickered, something like discomfort crossing his features, before he schooled them back into careful neutrality. I am aware of the circumstances surrounding your father's debt, he said quietly. It was not a decision I made lightly. Wasn't it? Elena asked, unable to stop herself. It seemed simple enough to you, Your Grace, from where I stood. A paper signed, a shop seized, a family's entire life upended, all without so much as a conversation beforehand. For a long moment, the Duke said nothing, and Elena wondered if she had finally pushed too far, if her carefully maintained composure had cracked one too many times and would cost her the fragile arrangement keeping her family afloat. But when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she expected, stripped of its usual cold authority. "The estate's finances are more precarious than you realize, Miss Marsh," he said. "My father left behind debts of his own, obligations far larger than the sum your father owed. I do not have the luxury of forgiving debts out of sympathy, however much I might wish otherwise in individual cases. Every note called in, every payment collected, keeps this house standing, and the people who depend upon it, servants included, fed and housed. It is not cruelty that drives these decisions. It is necessity." Elena studied him carefully, searching his face for the calculation she expected to find there, the practiced excuse of a wealthy man justifying his own comfort. But what she found instead was something closer to exhaustion, the same deep weariness she had glimpsed the night he had spoken her name in the firelight. "I did not realize," she said finally, some of the anger draining out of her voice. "I assumed, given the size of this house, the portraits, the gardens, that money was not a concern here. Appearances are often deceiving," the Duke said, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. "This house requires appearances to maintain its standing, its connections, its ability to secure the very deals that keep it from collapsing entirely. It is, in some ways, its own kind of debt, one that never truly resolves itself." They sat in a strange, unexpected silence after that, the accounting figures forgotten between them, and Elena found herself, for the first time, seeing the Duke not as the villain she had cast him as in her mind, but as a man trapped by circumstances of his own, burdened by a title and an inheritance that demanded far more from him than most people ever guessed. "Why tell me this?" she asked eventually. "I am a servant in your household. These are not matters that concern me." "Perhaps," the Duke said, "I grow tired of being surrounded by people who either fear me too much to speak honestly or flatter me too much to be trusted." He looked at her then, something searching in his gaze. "You have done neither since the day you arrived, Miss Marsh. It is, I confess, a novelty I did not expect to find valuable." Elena did not know how to respond to that, and so she said nothing at all, gathering the accounting papers and rising from her seat with as much composure as she could manage, despite the strange warmth blooming in her chest at his words. The days that followed brought no further such conversations, as though the Duke, having revealed more than he intended, retreated once more behind his usual careful walls. But something had shifted between them nonetheless, a subtle change in the quality of their exchanges that Elena could not entirely explain, even to herself. He no longer summoned her for tasks she suspected were mere pretexts, but their genuine conversations, when they occurred, carried a different weight than before, less like master addressing servant, and more like two people slowly, cautiously, feeling out the edges of an unexpected understanding. Lady Priscilla's departure, when it finally came, brought a palpable relief to the household, though Elena noticed the lady's parting words to the Duke carried a sharp edge that suggested their earlier disagreement remained unresolved. "Think carefully, Sebastian," Elena overheard the lady say as she passed through the entrance hall on an errand. "The family's reputation depends on careful alliances, not sentiment. I would hate to see you throw away everything your father built for some passing fascination that will only complicate matters further." The Duke's response was too quiet for Elena to catch, but Lady Priscilla's cool, assessing glance in her direction as she climbed into her carriage left little doubt about who, exactly, the passing fascination in question might be. Elena hurried on with her errand, cheeks burning, though whether from embarrassment or something else entirely, she could not have said. That evening, Elena found herself once again in the study, delivering the last of the day's correspondence. The Duke was seated at his desk, though he was not working, simply staring at a small portrait she had noticed before, on the corner of his desk. A painting of a stern-faced older man, she assumed must be his late father. "You are staring at that portrait a great deal lately," Elena observed, setting the letters down carefully. My father built everything you see around you, the Duke said, not looking away from the painting. This house, this title, the connections that keep it all standing. He also built a great many debts I did not learn of until after his death, obligations that nearly brought the entire estate to ruin. I have spent every year since trying to hold together what he left behind, and some days I wonder if I am succeeding at anything at all, beyond simply delaying the inevitable collapse. You seem to be succeeding well enough, Elena said gently. The house stands. The staff are paid and cared for. Whatever burden your father left you, you have carried it without breaking. The Duke finally looked away from the portrait, meeting her eyes with an expression she had not seen from him before, something raw and unguarded. You are the first person in this house to say such a thing to me directly, rather than simply flattering my title or fearing my temper, he said. I find I do not know quite what to do with honesty, Miss Marsh. It has been in short supply in my life for a very long time. Elena felt something soften further in her chest, the careful wall of anger she had maintained since arriving at the manor developing small, undeniable cracks. Perhaps, she said carefully, you have simply been surrounded by the wrong people, Your Grace. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Perhaps, he agreed quietly. I have. The conversation ended there, neither of them quite willing to push further into territory that felt, suddenly, far more dangerous than any accounting error or household dispute. But as Elena left the study that night, she carried with her the growing uncomfortable awareness that whatever careful distance she had intended to maintain between herself and Duke Sebastian Ashworth was slipping further from her grasp with every passing day, and she was no longer entirely certain she wanted to hold on to it as tightly as she once had. A fortnight after Lady Priscilla's departure, Mrs. Bellamy informed Elena that she had been granted a rare day away from her duties to visit her family, a small kindness Elena suspected had not come without the Duke's approval, given how strictly he governed the household's schedule. She set out early, walking the familiar 3 miles back toward town, with a lightness in her step she had not felt in weeks, eager to see her mother's face and hear Peter's voice again after so long apart. She found her mother sitting up in bed, color returned to her cheeks, in a way that eased some of the constant worry Elena carried for her. Peter had grown, it seemed, in the short weeks since she had last seen him, his shoulders broader, his voice carrying a new, deeper note. You look well, her mother said, studying Elena's face carefully. Better than I expected, given everything. The work is honest, Elena said, choosing her words carefully, unwilling to burden her mother with the complicated tangle of feelings she carried about the manor and its master. The household treats me fairly. And the Duke? Her mother asked, her eyes sharp despite her illness. Is he as cruel as the town gossips claim? Elena hesitated, surprised by how difficult the question proved to answer honestly. He is exacting, she said finally. Difficult, in his own way, but not cruel, not truly. There is more to him than the town gossips understand. Her mother's expression grew thoughtful at that, though she said nothing further on the matter, simply reaching out to squeeze Elena's hand with a warmth that made Elena's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Peter, for his part, peppered her with questions about the manor itself, about the size of the house, and the grandeur of its grounds, his curiosity untouched by the resentment Elena still occasionally felt toward the family that had upended their lives so completely. Do you think, Peter asked, as Elena prepared to leave that evening, that the shop will truly be returned to us, once your year is finished? That is what was promised, Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she found herself uncertain exactly how she felt about the year's eventual end, about returning fully to her old life and leaving Ashworth Manor, and everything within it, behind forever. The walk back to the manor that evening was cold, the autumn air sharp with the promise of winter approaching, and Elena had not gone far before she heard the sound of carriage wheels behind her, slowing as they approached. She turned, startled, to find the Duke's own carriage pulling alongside her, the Duke himself, leaning out the window with an expression of mild irritation. You should not be walking alone on this road after dark, he said, without preamble. Get in. I am perfectly capable of walking, Your Grace, Elena said, though the cold had already begun seeping into her bones, and the offer of warmth and shelter was more tempting than she wanted to admit. That is not the point, the Duke said. Get in, Miss Marsh. before I am forced to have my driver remove you from the road by less dignified means." Elena climbed into the carriage, settling onto the seat across from him, with as much composure as she could manage, though her cheeks burned at the closeness of the space, the way his presence seemed to fill the small carriage entirely. "How did you know I would be on this road?" she asked. "Mrs. Bellamy mentioned you had gone to visit your family," the Duke said. "I had business in town this evening, and thought it prudent to ensure you returned safely, given the hour." He paused, then added, with something almost like reluctance, "Your family, how do they fare?" The question caught Elena off guard, its genuine concern so different from the cold indifference she had expected from him during their first meeting. "My mother's health improves slowly," she said. "My brother grows taller by the week, it seems. They are managing, given the circumstances." "Good," the Duke said simply, and turned to look out the window at the darkening countryside, leaving Elena to study his profile in the dim carriage light, wondering, not for the first time, how a man capable of such genuine concern could also be the one responsible for the debt that had torn her family's life apart in the first place. The contradiction sat uneasily in her chest, refusing to resolve itself no matter how many times she turned it over in her mind during the quiet remainder of the ride back to the manor. When the carriage finally rolled to a stop before the great stone entrance, the Duke stepped down first and offered his hand to help her descend, an old-fashioned courtesy that seemed strangely out of place given everything that stood between them. Elena hesitated only a moment before accepting it, her fingers small and cold against his, and for a brief instant neither of them moved, the moment stretching longer than propriety strictly allowed. "Thank you," she said finally, pulling her hand back and stepping onto the gravel drive. "For the ride, Your Grace. It was kind of you." "I am not often accused of kindness," the Duke said, a faint, wry note entering his voice. "You may find, Miss Marsh, that I have made a habit of surprising you since your arrival." "You have," Elena admitted, unable to stop the small smile that tugged at the corner of her mouth despite herself, "though I confess I remain uncertain what to make of it." "Then we are, at least, uncertain together," the Duke said, and for a moment something passed between them that felt entirely unlike master and servant, something closer to two people standing on the edge of an understanding neither was quite ready to name aloud. Elena excused herself soon after, retreating to her small room with her thoughts in a tangle she could not begin to unravel. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the same ceiling that had once felt so foreign to her, now grown strangely familiar, turning over every word, every glance, every unexpected kindness the Duke had shown her since Lady Priscilla's warning, since the quiet conversation about his father, since the carriage ride home through the cold autumn dark. She reminded herself, as she had every night since arriving at Ashworth Manor, exactly what this man's estate had cost her family. She reminded herself of the shop taken, the year of servitude owed, the careful distance she had promised herself she would maintain no matter what small kindnesses he offered along the way. But even as she repeated these reminders like a prayer against sleep, Elena could not deny the quiet, growing truth settling into her chest. Whatever wall she had built against Duke Sebastian Ashworth, on that first cold morning, when the debt collectors knocked on her door, was crumbling, brick by careful brick, faster than she knew how to stop. Winter arrived at Ashworth Manor with a suddenness that surprised everyone, frost creeping across the windows overnight and turning the gardens into a landscape of silver and gray. Elena adjusted to the changing season, much as she had adjusted to everything else since her arrival, with quiet determination and a growing familiarity with the rhythms of the great house that had once felt so alien to her. It was during one of the coldest weeks of the season that Elena first noticed something troubling in the household's accounts. She had been assigned, increasingly, to assist with the estate's correspondence and record-keeping, a task the Duke had entrusted to her with growing confidence after their conversation about her father's bookkeeping. While reviewing a set of ledgers left carelessly open on the study desk, Elena's sharp eye caught a discrepancy that made her pause. A payment recorded as sent to a tenant farmer for repairs did not match the sum noted in a separate record of the estate's outgoing funds. The difference was small, easily dismissed as a clerical error, but something about the pattern nagged at Elena's memory. She had seen similar small discrepancies before, scattered across other pages she had reviewed in recent weeks. each one easily explained away on its own, but troubling when considered together. She said nothing at first, uncertain whether raising the matter might overstep her place in the household, or worse, cast suspicion on herself for having examined records not strictly her concern. But the discrepancies continued to bother her over the following days, small numbers that refused to add up correctly no matter how she turned them over in her mind. It was Mr. Whitfield, the estate's longtime steward, who finally gave her pause enough to act. She encountered him one afternoon in the corridor outside the study, and something in his manner, a nervous energy beneath his usually composed exterior, struck her as odd. "Miss Marsh," he said, his voice carrying a forced pleasantness that did not quite reach his eyes. "I understand you have been assisting His Grace with the household ledgers of late." "Only with correspondence, Mr. Whitfield," Elena said carefully, sensing something beneath the question that put her instinctively on guard. "The accounts remain your responsibility, as always." "Of course," Whitfield said, though his relief at her answer was poorly hidden. "It is simply important that such matters remain properly organized, without confusion from those unfamiliar with the estate's particular arrangements." The conversation left Elena unsettled long after Whitfield had continued on his way, and that evening, unable to shake her growing suspicion, she gathered her courage and approached the Duke in his study, the discrepancies she had noticed carefully documented on a separate sheet of paper. "Your Grace," she said, using the title without hesitation for once, the seriousness of the matter overriding her usual small rebellion. "I have found something in the household ledgers that troubles me. I do not know if it is significant, but I felt you should be aware." The Duke looked up from his own work, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to sharp attention as Elena laid out the discrepancies she had discovered, the small but consistent gaps between recorded payments and actual outgoing funds, spread across months of records. "These are minor sums," the Duke said, studying her notes carefully. "Easily the result of simple bookkeeping errors." "Perhaps," Elena said. "But the pattern is consistent, Your Grace. Errors of this nature tend to be random, sometimes favoring one direction, sometimes another. These discrepancies favor the same direction every time, and the sums, though individually small, add to a considerable amount when taken together over the course of a year." The Duke was silent for a long moment, studying the neat columns of figures Elena had compiled, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "You believe someone is deliberately altering these records?" he said finally, not quite a question. "I do not wish to accuse anyone without proof," Elena said carefully, "but I believe the matter deserves closer examination." The Duke's jaw tightened, and Elena watched something harden in his eyes, the careful, controlled anger of a man who took the management of his household extremely seriously. "Mr. Whitfield has managed this estate's finances since before my father's death," he said slowly. "If there is truth to this, it would explain a great deal about debts I inherited that never quite made sense to me, sums that seemed larger than the estate's actual expenditures could account for." "I did not mean to suggest Mr. Whitfield specifically," Elena said quickly, though even as she spoke the words, she remembered the steward's nervous manner in the corridor, the poorly hidden relief at her assurance that the accounts remained solely his concern. "You need not soften the accusation on my behalf, Miss Marsh," the Duke said. "I have long suspected something was amiss with this estate's finances, something beyond simply the debts my father accumulated before his death. I simply lacked the proof, or perhaps the sharp enough eye, to identify it clearly." He looked at her then, something like genuine gratitude softening his stern features. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. It could not have been an easy decision, given the risk of raising suspicion against a man who has served this household for many years." "I only wish to see the truth uncovered, Your Grace," Elena said, "whatever that truth might be." Over the following days, the Duke conducted a quiet investigation into the estate's finances, examining records Elena had not been given access to, cross-referencing years of accounts with a thoroughness that spoke to how seriously he took the matter. Elena assisted where she could, her sharp eye for numbers proving invaluable as they worked through stacks of ledgers late into the evenings, the two of them often the only ones still awake in the great house as the investigation deepened. These late evenings brought a new kind of closeness between them, one built not on stolen glances or careful conversations about grief and duty, but on shared purpose, the quiet camaraderie of two people working toward a common goal. Elena found herself looking forward to these evenings more than she wanted to admit, the way the Duke's careful composure relaxed slightly, when it was only the two of them, papers spread across the desk between them, the fire crackling low in the hearth. "You have a gift for this," the Duke observed one evening, watching as Elena traced a discrepancy through 3 separate ledgers with practiced efficiency. "Your father taught you well. He always said numbers do not lie, even when people do," Elena said, a small, sad smile touching her lips at the memory. "It seems he was right." "I am sorry," the Duke said quietly, "for what happened to him, to your family, because of debts and dealings that had little to do with any wrongdoing on your father's part. If what we are uncovering here proves true, it is possible the terms he was given were less fair than they should have been, manipulated by the very man meant to oversee such arrangements honestly." Elena looked up at him, surprised by the depth of regret in his voice. "You could not have known," she said. "You cannot carry guilt for every decision made by those who served your family before you inherited this burden." "Perhaps not," the Duke said, "but I can ensure it does not happen again, to your family or to anyone else under this estate's protection." He paused, studying her with an expression Elena had come to recognize over the past weeks, something warm and searching that made her pulse quicken despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I find myself grateful, Miss Marsh, that circumstances brought you to this household, whatever the painful cost that brought you here." Elena did not know how to respond to such an admission. Her heart caught somewhere between the lingering anger she still carried for her family's suffering and the undeniable warmth growing in her chest for the man sitting across from her. A man who had proven, over these past weeks, to be far more complicated and far more decent than the cold, imperious figure she had first encountered at the manor's gates. "I am grateful as well," she said finally, the words surprising her with their honesty. "Though I confess, I did not expect to feel so, given how our acquaintance began." The Duke's expression softened further at her words, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet crackle of the fire the only sound in the study as something unspoken passed between them, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably present. It was Elena who finally broke the silence, gathering the scattered ledgers with hands that were not quite steady. "It grows late, Your Grace," she said. "We should continue this tomorrow, with clearer heads." "Of course," the Duke agreed, though something in his voice suggested reluctance to end the evening. "Good night, Elena." The use of her given name, offered so easily now, compared to the startled slip of weeks before, sent a warmth through her chest that she carried with her all the way back to her small room, where she lay awake long into the night, no longer entirely certain which frightened her more, the growing evidence of betrayal within the estate's own walls, or the growing, undeniable feelings taking root in her heart for the very man whose family's debt had first brought her to Ashworth Manor. The investigation continued through the following week, and with each new ledger examined, the picture grew clearer and more damning. Mr. Whitfield, it seemed, had been quietly siphoning funds from the estate for years, disguising the theft through a careful pattern of inflated repair costs, falsified tenant payments, and altered records that had gone unnoticed by anyone lacking Elena's particular gift for numbers. The sums, once totaled across the years, were staggering, far larger than Elena had first suspected, enough to explain a significant portion of the debts the Duke had inherited and struggled to manage since his father's death. "He must have begun during my father's final illness," the Duke said one evening, his voice tight with barely controlled anger as he reviewed the final tally of the steward's apparent theft. "When my father was too weak to oversee the accounts himself, and I was too consumed with grief and the sudden weight of the title to examine matters as closely as I should have." "You cannot blame yourself for trusting a man your family had employed for years," Elena said gently, though she understood the particular guilt that came from feeling one should have seen a betrayal sooner, a guilt she recognized from her own quiet anger toward herself for not questioning her father's debt more closely while he lived. "Perhaps not," the Duke said, "but I can ensure he answers for it now." He set down the papers with careful precision, though his hands betrayed the tension coiled beneath his controlled exterior. "I intend to confront him tomorrow, with the evidence laid plain before him. I would ask you to be present, if you are willing. Your work uncovered this deception. It seems only right that you witness its unraveling." Elena agreed, though privately she felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect, uncertain how a man capable of such calculated deception might react when finally cornered with the proof of his own dishonesty. That night, sleep came slowly, her mind turning over every detail of the evidence they had gathered. Every small discrepancy that had, piece by piece, revealed a betrayal far larger and more damaging than she had first imagined. The confrontation, when it came the following morning, unfolded with a tense formality that Elena would remember for a long time afterward. The Duke summoned Whitfield to the study, and Elena stood quietly near the window as the steward entered, his usual composed demeanor faltering slightly at the sight of the ledgers spread across the desk, the careful notations in Elena's neat handwriting visible even from across the room. "Mr. Whitfield," the Duke said, his voice carrying a cold formality Elena had not heard from him in weeks, a reminder of the severe man she had first encountered at the manor's gates. "I have reviewed the estate's accounts thoroughly over these past days, with considerable assistance. Perhaps you would care to explain the discrepancies we have uncovered." Whitfield's face paled, though he attempted, briefly, to maintain his composure. "Discrepancies, Your Grace? I am certain any errors are simply the result of the complexity involved in managing an estate of this size. Numbers are easily miscounted, records easily. Do not insult my intelligence, or Miss Marsh's considerable skill with figures, by pretending these are simple errors," the Duke cut in, his voice sharp enough that Whitfield flinched visibly. "The pattern is consistent across nearly a decade of records: inflated repair costs, falsified tenant payments, sums quietly redirected from this estate's funds into accounts that do not appear anywhere in the legitimate records of this household. I want the truth, Mr. Whitfield, and I want it now." The steward's composure crumbled entirely under the weight of the evidence laid before him, and after a long, tense silence, he finally admitted to the scheme, the words spilling out in a rush of justification and poorly disguised guilt. He spoke of debts of his own, gambling losses accumulated over years, a desperation that had led him, slowly and then with growing confidence as the years passed without detection, to siphon funds from an estate he believed too large and too poorly overseen by a grieving young duke to ever notice the theft. "You believed I would not notice," the Duke said quietly, once Whitfield's confession had finally trailed off, "because you believed grief had made me careless. You were nearly right, Mr. Whitfield. Were it not for Miss Marsh's diligence, this theft might have continued indefinitely, bleeding this estate dry, while the tenants and staff who depend upon it suffered the consequences of debts that were never truly theirs to bear." The steward was dismissed that same day, the full extent of his theft to be pursued through proper legal channels in the weeks that followed. As Elena watched him gather his few belongings from the estate office under the watchful eye of the household guards, she felt a strange mixture of vindication and sorrow, relief that the truth had finally come to light, but also a quiet grief for the years of suffering the betrayal had caused, for her own father's debt, inflated and manipulated by a man motivated by nothing more than his own desperate greed. "It does not undo what happened to your family," the Duke said later that evening, finding her still in the study long after Whitfield's departure, staring at the now familiar ledgers with a heaviness she could not quite shake. "But it does mean the terms of your father's original debt may have been far less fair than they should have been. I intend to review the matter properly, once the legal proceedings against Whitfield are concluded, and adjust your family's remaining obligation accordingly." Elena looked up at him, surprised by the offer, though not, she realized, entirely surprised by the man making it. "You do not have to do that," she said. "The arrangement was already generous, given the circumstances." "I do have to do it," the Duke said firmly. "Not out of charity, Miss Marsh, but out of justice. Your father did not deserve to have his debt inflated by a dishonest steward's greed, and you do not deserve to serve a year in payment for sums that were never truly owed in the first place." He paused, something softer entering his expression. "Whatever the final reckoning proves to be, I want you to know that uncovering this theft, and seeing justice done for it, mattered to me far beyond its impact on this estate's finances. It mattered because it mattered to you." The quiet sincerity in his voice left Elena momentarily speechless, the careful walls she had maintained against him since her arrival feeling more fragile than ever in the face of such genuine consideration. She thought, in that moment, of Lady Priscilla's cold warning, of Mrs. Bellamy's careful caution about the Duke's difficult moods, and found she could no longer reconcile either warning with the man standing before her now, a man who had fought for the truth on her behalf, who spoke of justice rather than mere duty, who looked at her, even now, with an expression that made her heart ache with feelings she was no longer certain she could deny. "Thank you," she said softly, and this time, when she said his title, it did not feel like a small rebellion at all, but something closer to genuine respect, freely given, rather than grudgingly offered. "Your Grace." The Duke's expression shifted at the words, something warm and hopeful flickering behind his careful composure, though neither of them spoke further of the moment, both retreating instead into a comfortable, charged silence that carried them through the remainder of that quiet, momentous evening. News of Mr. Whitfield's dismissal spread quickly through the household, and with it came a shift in how the staff regarded Elena. Charlotte, always the friendliest of the maids, took to seeking her out during quiet moments, curious about the details of the steward's downfall, while Mrs. Bellamy's usual sharp caution softened into something closer to genuine respect. "You have done this house a great service, girl," the housekeeper told her one afternoon, as they folded linens together in companionable quiet. "Whatever else comes of your time here, know that it will be remembered." Elena appreciated the kind words, though she found herself distracted, in the weeks that followed, by matters far more complicated than the household's shifting opinion of her. The evenings she and the Duke had spent poring over ledgers together had left behind a closeness neither of them seemed willing to name directly, but which colored every interaction between them nonetheless. He sought her out more openly now, no longer bothering to construct flimsy pretexts about correspondence or accounting errors, simply inviting her to join him in the study after her duties were finished, ostensibly to discuss the estate's improving finances, though their conversations wandered, more often than not, into far more personal territory. She learned, during these quiet evenings, of his childhood spent largely in the shadow of a demanding father who valued duty above affection, of a mother who had died when he was still young, leaving him with only vague, fading memories of warmth before the household settled into the cold formality that had defined it ever since. She told him, in turn, of her own father's patient teaching, of long afternoons spent learning to measure cloth and balance accounts in the small shop that had felt, for all its modest size, like the safest place in the world. "I never expected to speak so openly with anyone," the Duke admitted one evening, firelight casting long shadows across his face, as he studied her with an expression she had come to recognize, warm and searching, and entirely unguarded. "Certainly not with someone I once believed I had wronged so completely." "Perhaps that is precisely why it feels different," Elena said softly. "There is no pretense left between us, Your Grace, only honesty." It was a dangerous kind of honesty, Elena knew, one that grew harder to contain with each passing evening, each shared glance that lingered a moment too long, each quiet laugh that softened the careful distance she had once been so determined to maintain. She told herself, repeatedly, that nothing could truly come of these growing feelings, that the gulf between a duke and a servant working off her family's debt remained as vast and unbridgeable as ever, regardless of whatever warmth had grown between them in the quiet hours of the evening. But telling herself this did little to slow the way her heart quickened whenever he entered a room, or the way she found herself thinking of him even during the quiet, solitary hours of her own small chamber. It was into this fragile, growing understanding that Lady Priscilla returned, unannounced and clearly displeased, less than a month after Whitfield's dismissal had been reported through the usual channels of gossip that connected the great houses of the region. "I hear you have dismissed Whitfield," Lady Priscilla said without preamble, sweeping into the drawing room where Elena happened to be finishing alterations to a set of curtains, the Duke seated nearby reviewing correspondence. "And on the word of a seamstress, no less." "On the evidence Miss Marsh uncovered," the Duke corrected, his tone carrying a warning edge Elena had rarely heard him use with his cousin before. "Evidence that proved entirely accurate, and which has already improved this estate's finances considerably since his departure." "How fortunate," Lady Priscilla said, her eyes narrowing as she looked between the Duke and Elena, with an assessment that made Elena's skin prickle with unease. "It seems Miss Marsh has made herself rather indispensable to this household, in more ways than one." "She has proven a valuable member of this household staff," the Duke said, though something in his careful phrasing suggested he understood, as well as Elena did, the deeper implication buried within his cousin's words. "I fail to see the concern in that." Lady Priscilla's smile turned brittle. The concern, cousin, is that this family's standing depends on careful alliances, not on servants who overstep their place, however useful they might prove in matters of household accounting. I had hoped, given time, that you would come to your senses regarding certain arrangements we discussed during my last visit. Instead, I find you have grown only more entangled with a girl entirely unsuited to your station. That is quite enough, Priscilla, the Duke said, his voice cold in a way Elena had not heard, directed at anyone but Whitfield since her arrival. Miss Marsh's worth to this household, and to me personally, is not a matter for your judgment. The words, spoken so openly in Elena's presence, sent a flush of warmth through her chest, despite the tension of the moment, though she kept her eyes carefully fixed on her sewing, unwilling to draw further attention to herself in the charged silence that followed. Lady Priscilla's gaze flickered toward her, sharp and calculating, before she offered a stiff, tight smile and excused herself from the room without further comment. But Elena did not believe, even for a moment, that the matter had truly ended there. She had seen enough of Lady Priscilla's manner during her previous visit to recognize a woman who did not easily abandon her intentions, however firmly rebuffed, and the calculating glint in the lady's eyes as she departed the drawing room left Elena with a distinct sense of unease that lingered long after the confrontation had ended. Her instincts proved correct within days. Rumors began circulating through the household with unusual speed, whispers that Elena had used underhanded means to secure her position in the Duke's favor, that her uncovering of Whitfield's theft had been staged somehow to make herself appear indispensable, that she harbored ambitions far beyond her proper station that threatened the household's reputation and the Duke's judgment alike. Elena traced the rumors easily enough to a maid recently hired at Lady Priscilla's recommendation, though proving the connection directly proved more difficult than simply recognizing its likely source. Pay them no mind, Charlotte advised her one evening, finding Elena unusually quiet during their shared duties in the linen room. Everyone with sense in this house knows the truth of what happened with Whitfield. Lady Priscilla's schemes rarely find the traction she hopes for, not with staff who have served this family long enough to see through her manipulations. But Elena found it harder to dismiss the whispers as easily as Charlotte suggested, aware of how quickly reputation, once tarnished, could prove difficult to fully restore, particularly for someone in her precarious position within the household. She said nothing to the Duke directly about the rumors, unwilling to add further complication to an already delicate situation, though she suspected, from the increasingly protective way he began treating her in the days that followed, that he had heard the whispers himself and understood their likely source without needing to be told. The tension came to a head nearly 2 weeks later, during a small gathering the Duke hosted for several neighboring families, an event Lady Priscilla had somehow arranged to attend, despite not having been formally invited. Elena, assigned to assist with the evening's preparations, rather than attend as a guest, found herself passing through the drawing room on an errand just as Lady Priscilla was holding court among a small cluster of guests, her voice carrying just loudly enough to ensure Elena would hear the words as she passed. "It is remarkable, is it not?" Lady Priscilla was saying, "how quickly some people rise above their station, when circumstances allow. One wonders what lengths a desperate young woman might go to secure favor with a lonely, grieving Duke, particularly one so recently freed from an inconvenient steward, who might have otherwise noticed such calculated ambitions." The insinuation was unmistakable, and Elena felt her face burn with a mixture of anger and humiliation, as several of the assembled guests turned curious, assessing eyes in her direction. She kept her composure with considerable effort, completing her errand and retreating from the room as quickly as propriety allowed, though the words followed her long after she had escaped the drawing room's watchful eyes. She did not see the Duke's reaction to his cousin's pointed remarks, having fled the room before he could respond, but she heard, later that evening from Mrs. Bellamy, that he had addressed the matter directly and firmly before the assembled guests, defending Elena's character and her contributions to the household in terms that left little room for further doubt among those present. It was, Mrs. Bellamy reported with evident satisfaction, the most openly the Duke had ever spoken in defense of any member of his staff, servant or otherwise, and the household gossip that followed carried a very different tenor than the whispers Lady Priscilla had attempted to seed in the preceding weeks. But Elena understood, even as the immediate crisis passed, that Lady Priscilla would not simply abandon her campaign after a single public setback. The lady's cold, calculating eyes, as she had delivered her pointed remarks in the drawing room, carried the promise of further schemes yet to come, and Elena found herself wondering, with growing unease, exactly what lengths Lady Priscilla might be willing to go to in order to remove what she clearly perceived as an unwelcome obstacle, standing between herself and whatever ambitions she still held regarding the Duke and his estate. Later that night, long after the guests had departed and the household had finally settled into quiet, Elena found herself unable to sleep, the humiliation of Lady Priscilla's public insinuation still burning fresh in her mind, despite the Duke's defense of her character. She rose from her narrow bed and made her way, quietly, toward the small kitchen garden at the rear of the house, hoping the cold night air might help clear her troubled thoughts. She found the Duke there instead, standing alone near the frost-covered hedges, his coat pulled tight against the winter chill, apparently seeking the same quiet solitude that had drawn her outside. "You should be resting," he said, though his voice carried no reproach, only a quiet concern that eased some of the tension still coiled in Elena's chest. "I could not sleep," she admitted, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she moved to stand beside him. "The evening's events left my thoughts too troubled for rest." "I am sorry for what my cousin said to you," the Duke said, his jaw tightening with remembered anger. "It was cruel, and entirely without merit, and I made certain every guest present understood as much before the evening concluded." "I heard," Elena said softly. "Mrs. Bellamy told me. Thank you for defending me so openly. I know it cannot have been an easy thing, given your family's connection to Lady Priscilla." "It was the easiest thing I have done in a very long time," the Duke said, turning to face her fully, his expression illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the bare winter branches above them. "Elena, I would defend you against far worse than my cousin's petty insinuations, if it came to that. You must understand, by now, that my regard for you extends far beyond any duty I owe you as a member of my household." The words hung in the cold night air between them, and Elena felt her heart quicken at the raw honesty in his voice, the careful composure he usually maintained, slipping away entirely in the quiet privacy of the moonlit garden. "Your Grace," she began, though even as she spoke the title, it felt hollow and insufficient against the weight of what he was saying, what she felt stirring in her own chest in response. "Sebastian," he corrected gently, "please, not tonight. Not after everything my cousin said, after everything you have endured in this household because of a debt that was never truly fair, because of a scheme uncovered through your own diligence, because of rumors spread by people who cannot understand the person you truly are. Tonight, I would simply like to be a man speaking honestly to a woman he has come to care for deeply, without the weight of titles standing between us." Elena's breath caught at the vulnerability in his request, at the way his given name hung unspoken between them, close enough to touch but still, somehow, beyond her ability to voice it fully. Not yet. Not when so much still stood unresolved between them despite everything that had grown in her heart over the preceding weeks. "I care for you as well," she said instead, the admission costing her something, even as it brought a profound relief to finally speak it aloud. "More than I ever expected to, given how our acquaintance began. But I am still a servant in this household, Your Grace, working off a debt that, however unfairly inflated it may have proven to be, remains a debt nonetheless. I do not know what place there could possibly be for feelings such as these, given everything that stands between us. Perhaps there is no easy answer to that question yet," the Duke admitted, though he did not step away from her, close enough now that Elena could feel the warmth of him, even through the cold night air. "But I do not believe impossible obstacles are the same as insurmountable ones, Elena. I have spent this past year rebuilding an estate nearly destroyed by betrayal and neglect. I do not intend to abandon something as valuable as what has grown between us, simply because convention suggests it should remain impossible." Elena did not know how to respond to such quiet, determined conviction, her heart caught between hope and the practical fears that had governed her life since her father's death. Fears of loss, of disappointment, of trusting too deeply, only to have that trust betrayed once again by circumstances beyond her control. She said nothing, but she did not step away either, and for a long, quiet moment, they simply stood together in the frost-covered garden, the unspoken understanding between them growing stronger even without further words to name it. It was the Duke who finally broke the silence, his voice returning to something closer to its usual careful control, though the warmth beneath it remained unmistakable. "You should return to your rest," he said. "It grows late, and tomorrow will bring its own challenges, whatever my cousin might still be scheming." Elena nodded, though she found herself reluctant to leave the quiet intimacy of the moment. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, offering the title once more, though this time it felt less like distance and more like a small, private acknowledgement of everything still unresolved between them. "Good night, Elena," he replied, and watched her retreat back toward the house with an expression she could not quite read in the darkness, though she carried the warmth of it with her all the way back to her small room, where sleep, when it finally came, was filled with dreams far more hopeful than any she had allowed herself since first arriving at Ashworth Manor's cold and forbidding gates so many months before. She did not know, as she finally drifted into uneasy rest, that in a guest chamber elsewhere in the great house, Lady Priscilla lay awake as well, her mind turning over increasingly desperate schemes to separate her cousin from the seamstress who had, against every expectation, captured his affection so completely, and that the coming weeks would bring a confrontation far more dangerous than any public insinuation delivered in a crowded drawing room. The weeks following the moonlit garden conversation brought a fragile, unspoken understanding between Elena and the Duke, one neither of them dared to name openly before the household, though the change in their manner toward each other did not go entirely unnoticed by the sharper-eyed members of the staff. Charlotte took to giving Elena knowing smiles during their shared duties, and even Mrs. Bellamy's usual brisk efficiency softened, on occasion, into something like quiet approval whenever she observed the two of them together. But the growing closeness between them did nothing to diminish the practical obstacles still standing in their way, obstacles that became starkly apparent when a letter arrived at the manor bearing news that sent the household into a flurry of anxious preparation. A delegation from the Crown's Treasury Office, responsible for reviewing the finances of noble estates suspected of financial irregularity, had requested a formal audit of Ashworth Manor's accounts, a routine matter under ordinary circumstances, but one that carried considerable risk given the recent discovery of Whitfield's theft and the estate's still recovering finances. "They will want assurance that the matter has been fully resolved," the Duke explained to Elena one evening, spreading the official correspondence across his desk with visible tension in his shoulders, "that the theft has ended, that proper safeguards are now in place, and that the estate's finances, despite the losses uncovered, remain sound enough to meet its obligations. A poor showing could bring further scrutiny, further complications that this estate cannot easily withstand, given everything it has already endured this past year." "Then we will ensure the showing is not poor," Elena said firmly, already reaching for the nearest stack of ledgers with the same determined focus she had brought to uncovering Whitfield's deception months before. "I have kept careful records since the theft was discovered. Between the two of us, we can present the Treasury delegation with accounts thorough and transparent enough to satisfy even the most exacting scrutiny." The Duke looked at her with an expression of such genuine gratitude that Elena felt her chest tighten with emotion. "I do not know what I would have done these past months without your assistance," he said quietly. "Not simply with the accounts, though that has proven invaluable, but with everything. You have become essential to this household's recovery, in ways I never anticipated when you first arrived." "We make a good team, Your Grace," Elena said, a small smile touching her lips, despite the seriousness of the task ahead of them. The days that followed brought long hours of careful preparation, Elena and the Duke working side by side to organize the estate's records into a presentation thorough enough to withstand the Treasury delegation's scrutiny. It was exhausting work, but Elena found herself grateful for the shared purpose, for the way it allowed them to spend hours together without the careful formality that still governed their interactions before the rest of the household, a formality neither of them had yet found the courage to fully abandon, despite the understanding growing between them. It was during one of these long evenings, less than a week before the delegation's scheduled arrival, that Lady Priscilla struck again, though this time with far greater cunning than her previous public insinuations had shown. Elena discovered the trouble when Mrs. Bellamy summoned her urgently to the estate office, her usually composed face tight with worry. "A sum of money has gone missing from the household's petty cash reserve," the housekeeper explained, her voice low with concern. "Discovered only this morning, when the accounts were being finalized for the Treasury delegation's review. His Grace has been informed." And I am afraid, Miss Marsh, that suspicion has already begun to fall in a particular direction. Elena's stomach dropped as understanding settled over her. Toward me, she said, though it was not truly a question. Lady Priscilla has been quite vocal in suggesting as much, Mrs. Bellamy confirmed grimly. She points out that you have had frequent access to the household accounts these past weeks, and that your sudden closeness to His Grace has given you opportunities and motivations that others in the household do not share. Elena felt a cold fury settle over her, quickly followed by a sharper, more frightening fear. She understood, with growing clarity, exactly what Lady Priscilla had likely done, engineering the theft herself or through some accomplice among the newer staff, timing it deliberately to coincide with the Treasury delegation's imminent arrival, ensuring maximum damage to both Elena's reputation and the estate's already precarious standing with the Crown's officials. She found the Duke in his study, his expression grave as he reviewed the discrepancy in the petty cash records, Lady Priscilla standing nearby, with an expression of carefully composed concern that did not quite mask the satisfaction lurking beneath it. "Your Grace," Elena said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. "I understand suspicion has fallen upon me regarding the missing funds. I assure you, I have taken nothing from this household's accounts, not one coin beyond what has been properly recorded." "I know," the Duke said simply, and the immediate, unwavering trust in his voice brought a rush of relief so profound that Elena's eyes stung with unexpected tears. "I do not believe for one moment that you are responsible for this, Elena, but I will need proof to satisfy the Treasury delegation and to silence those in this household who might suggest otherwise." His eyes flicked, briefly but pointedly, toward his cousin, and Lady Priscilla's composed expression flickered with something like alarm before she recovered herself. "I only raised a reasonable concern, Sebastian," she said quickly. "Given the timing, given her access, it seemed prudent to consider every possibility, however uncomfortable." "It seems curiously convenient," the Duke said coldly, "that this discrepancy appeared only days before the Treasury delegation's arrival, and only shortly after you yourself spent an afternoon reviewing the estate office's records, ostensibly to assist with preparations for their visit." Lady Priscilla's face paled slightly at the pointed observation, though she quickly gathered her composure once more. "You cannot possibly be suggesting that I would sabotage my own family's estate, Sebastian. The very idea is absurd." "I am suggesting nothing yet," the Duke said, "but I intend to discover the truth of this matter before the delegation arrives, whatever that truth proves to be, and whoever it ultimately implicates." The investigation that followed proved far more delicate than the one that had uncovered Whitfield's theft months before, given the personal stakes now involved and the limited time remaining before the Treasury delegation's scheduled visit. Elena worked tirelessly alongside the Duke, cross-referencing every entry in the household's records, examining the movements of every member of staff who might have had access to the missing funds, searching for the thread that would finally expose the truth of what had happened and clear her name definitively before suspicion could take deeper root. It was Charlotte, in the end, who provided the crucial piece of evidence, approaching Elena nervously on the evening before the delegation's arrival, with a confession that had clearly weighed heavily on her conscience. "I saw something," the young maid admitted, wringing her hands anxiously, "the night before the missing funds were discovered. I saw Lady Priscilla's own maid, the one hired on her recommendation just before her last visit, slipping out of the estate office late in the evening, when she had no proper business being there at all. I did not think much of it at the time, but given everything that has happened since, I felt I could not stay silent any longer." Elena brought Charlotte's account immediately to the Duke, and together they confronted Lady Priscilla's maid before the household's gathered senior staff, the young woman's composure crumbling swiftly under the combined weight of Charlotte's testimony and the Duke's stern, unrelenting questioning. She confessed, eventually, to taking the funds on Lady Priscilla's direct instruction, planting evidence meant to implicate Elena in the theft, all in service of a scheme designed to discredit her thoroughly before the Treasury delegation's arrival and, presumably, before whatever further ambitions Lady Priscilla still harbored regarding her cousin's future. The confrontation with Lady Priscilla herself that followed was brief but devastating. The Duke's fury barely contained beneath his usual careful composure as he laid out the full extent of her scheme before her: the maid's confession, Charlotte's testimony, the careful timing that could no longer be dismissed as mere coincidence. "You would sabotage this estate's standing with the crown itself," the Duke said, his voice low and dangerous, "simply to remove a woman you perceive as an obstacle to your own ambitions. I am ashamed to call you family, Priscilla, and I want you gone from this house before the delegation arrives tomorrow. Do not return uninvited again." Lady Priscilla's carefully maintained composure finally shattered entirely under the weight of her cousin's cold fury. Though whether from genuine remorse or simply the sting of a scheme thoroughly exposed and defeated, Elena could not say for certain. She departed the manor that same evening, her carriage disappearing down the frost-covered drive in a silence far heavier than any words could have carried, leaving behind a household considerably relieved to see the back of her, and an estate finally free, it seemed, of the schemes and betrayals that had shadowed it for so many months. The Treasury delegation's visit the following day proceeded without incident, the household's accounts presented with a thoroughness and transparency that satisfied even the most exacting scrutiny, thanks in no small part to the careful preparation Elena and the Duke had undertaken together in the preceding weeks. As the delegation's carriage finally departed, their approval secured, and the estate standing with the crown fully restored, Elena felt a profound sense of relief settle over her, though it was tempered by an awareness that the danger Lady Priscilla represented, however thoroughly defeated in this instance, had not necessarily been extinguished entirely. That evening, the household allowed itself a rare moment of celebration, Mrs. Bellamy authorizing an extra measure of good cheer among the staff in recognition of the successful audit and the relief of Lady Priscilla's departure. Elena found herself swept up in the light, easy warmth of the gathering, sharing quiet laughter with Charlotte and the other maids over cups of spiced cider in the servants' hall, a lightness she had not allowed herself to feel, since long before her father's death had upended her life so completely. It was the Duke, unusually, who sought her out amid the celebration, appearing in the doorway of the servants' hall with a slightly awkward expression, as though uncertain of his welcome in a space that belonged, by long custom, to his staff rather than to himself. "Your Grace," Mrs. Bellamy said, startled, rising quickly, along with the rest of the gathered servants, in a show of proper deference. "Please, sit," the Duke said, waving off the formality with visible discomfort. "I only wish to extend my thanks, to all of you, for your diligence these past weeks. This estate's recovery would not have been possible without the loyalty and hard work of everyone in this room." His eyes found Elena's across the hall, lingering there just a moment longer than strict propriety allowed. "Miss Marsh, might I have a word, when you have a moment?" Elena followed him out into the corridor, aware of the curious glances exchanged behind them among the staff, though she found she cared less about such gossip than she once might have. The Duke led her to a quiet alcove near the study, away from the noise of the celebration still carrying faintly from the servants' hall. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, once they were alone, away from the eyes of the household. "What you have done for this estate, Elena, uncovering Whitfield's theft, defending yourself and this household against Priscilla's schemes, preparing for the Treasury delegation with such thoroughness. It is more than I could have asked of anyone, let alone someone who came to this house owing nothing more than a debt, inherited unfairly from her father." "I did what needed to be done," Elena said, though the warmth in his voice brought a flush to her cheeks she could not entirely suppress. "The same as anyone in your position would have done, given the circumstances." "That is not true, and you know it," the Duke said, stepping closer, his voice softening further. "You have given this household, and given me, far more than duty ever required of you. I find myself wondering, more and more often, what I have done to deserve such loyalty, such courage, from someone who owes me nothing beyond the terms of an arrangement I forced upon her under difficult circumstances." "Perhaps," Elena said softly, meeting his gaze steadily, despite the way her heart raced at his nearness. "I no longer think of it as an arrangement at all, Your Grace." The words hung between them, fragile and significant, and for a long moment, the Duke simply looked at her, something raw and hopeful flickering behind his careful composure. He reached out, slowly, as though giving her every opportunity to step away if she wished, and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch entirely. "Elena," he said quietly, "I find myself wanting to say a great many things to you tonight, things I have held carefully in check for weeks now. mindful of everything standing between us. But I confess, in this moment, I am finding it increasingly difficult to remember exactly why those obstacles should matter so much, when everything in me simply wants to. A sudden commotion from the direction of the entrance hall interrupted him, raised voices and hurried footsteps carrying down the corridor with an urgency that immediately shattered the tender intimacy of the moment. The Duke's expression shifted instantly from warmth to alert concern, and Elena felt a cold premonition settle over her even before Mrs. Bellamy appeared, breathless and pale, at the end of the corridor. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "There has been an accident. A fire has broken out in the East Wing, near the old records room. The staff are working to contain it, but I fear it may spread further into the house, before it can be brought fully under control." The evening's warmth shattered instantly into chaos, the Duke's careful composure snapping into decisive action as he issued rapid instructions, organizing the household staff into a coordinated effort to contain the blaze, before it could threaten the manor's structure or endanger anyone within its walls. Elena followed close behind him toward the East Wing, her heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with flames, and everything to do with the unfinished words still hanging between them. Words she desperately hoped would not be lost entirely, amid whatever danger the night still had in store. Smoke already choked the air of the East Wing corridor by the time Elena reached it, thick gray tendrils curling beneath the old wooden doors of the records room, the acrid smell of burning paper and timber stinging her eyes and throat. Servants rushed past her in every direction, some carrying buckets of water drawn hastily from the kitchen pumps, others shouting instructions that overlapped into a chaotic din of urgency and fear. "Stay back," the Duke commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos with an authority that steadied the panicking staff, even as he moved forward himself, pulling his coat up over his mouth and nose as he approached the records room door. "The fire brigade has been sent for from the village, but it will take time to arrive. We must contain what we can until then." Elena watched in horror as flames licked hungrily at the doorframe, the old dry wood of the manor's East Wing, offering little resistance to the fire's spread. She thought immediately of the ledgers, the very records that had proven Whitfield's theft and secured the estate's standing with the Treasury delegation just that afternoon, now at grave risk of being consumed entirely by the flames. "The newest records," she called out, grabbing the Duke's arm before he could push further into the smoke-filled room. "The ones from this year, the ones proving the estate's recovery, they are in the cabinet nearest the window, not yet moved to the main study archive." "Elena, it is too dangerous," the Duke said, turning to face her with alarm plain on his features. "Stay here, with the others. I will retrieve what can be saved." But Elena had already made her decision, some fierce, protective instinct overriding her own fear entirely. "You cannot manage it alone, not quickly enough," she said, snatching a length of damp cloth from a nearby servant's bucket and pressing it over her own mouth and nose. "I know exactly where everything is kept. Together we can save what matters most, before the flames spread further." There was no time for further argument. The Duke's jaw tightened, but he nodded once, sharp and decisive, and together they pushed into the smoke-choked room, moving as quickly as the thickening haze allowed toward the cabinet Elena had indicated. Her eyes streamed from the smoke, her lungs burning with every breath despite the damp cloth held tight against her face, but she forced herself forward, guided by memory and determination, as much as by sight, until her hands finally closed around the cool brass handle of the cabinet drawer. She had barely begun pulling the precious ledgers free when a groan of splintering wood sounded from above, followed by a sharp, terrifying crack. Elena looked up just in time to see a burning support beam, weakened by the spreading flames, begin to give way directly above where she stood. "Elena!" The Duke's shout was the last thing she registered clearly before he crashed into her, his arms wrapping around her and driving them both away from the cabinet with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs entirely. The beam crashed down exactly where she had been standing a heartbeat before, sending a shower of sparks and burning debris across the floor, close enough that Elena felt the searing heat of it even as the Duke shielded her body with his own, curling protectively around her as they hit the floor together. For a long, terrifying moment, neither of them moved, the roar of the fire and the shouts of the staff outside the room seeming to fade into a strange, ringing silence as Elena registered, slowly, that she was still alive. still breathing, held tight against the Duke's chest as he checked her over with frantic, searching hands. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with a fear Elena had never heard from him before, so different from his usual careful control. "Elena, look at me. Are you hurt?" "I am well," she managed, though her voice came out shaky and hoarse from the smoke. "You saved me." "That beam would have." "Do not finish that sentence," the Duke said fiercely, pulling her closer against him, even as the fire continued to rage around the fallen beam, just feet away, blocking their most direct path back to the door. "We need to move, now, before the flames spread further." He pulled her to her feet, and together they scrambled toward an alternate route out of the room, coughing against the thickening smoke. The ledgers Elena had managed to save clutched tightly against her chest even as the Duke half-carried, half-guided her through the chaos toward the corridor beyond. They emerged, finally, into clearer air amid a chorus of relieved shouts from the assembled staff, Mrs. Bellamy rushing forward with tears of relief streaming down her face as she confirmed both of them were safe. The fire brigade arrived shortly after, bringing the blaze fully under control within the hour, though the records room itself was left charred and ruined, a stark reminder of how close disaster had truly come. But it was not the damage to the room that occupied Elena's thoughts as the chaos of the night finally began to settle. It was the memory of the Duke's body shielding hers from the falling beam, the raw fear in his voice as he had checked her for injury, the desperate way he had pulled her close, even as danger still surrounded them both. She found him later that night, standing alone near the manor's entrance, his face and clothes still streaked with soot, staring out at the smoldering remains of the east wing with an expression of exhausted relief. Elena approached quietly, and he turned at the sound of her footsteps, something fierce and unguarded crossing his features at the sight of her, safe and whole before him. "You should not have come into that room," he said, though there was no true reproach in his voice, only lingering fear finally finding an outlet, now that the immediate danger had passed. "When I saw that beam falling, when I thought for even a moment that I might lose you." He stopped, his voice catching, and Elena watched him struggle visibly to find the words for feelings that had clearly overwhelmed his usual careful composure entirely. "But you did not lose me," Elena said gently, closing the remaining distance between them. "We are both safe, thanks to you." "Thanks to us both," the Duke corrected, reaching up to gently brush a streak of soot from her cheek, his touch lingering with a tenderness that made her breath catch, despite the exhaustion weighing on them both after the night's terror. "Elena, I told you earlier this evening, before the fire interrupted us, that I found myself wanting to say a great many things to you. I do not wish to wait any longer to say them, not after tonight, not after coming so close to losing the chance entirely." Elena's heart pounded, anticipation and fear and hope tangling together in her chest as she waited for him to continue. The ruined records room forgotten entirely, amid the weight of the moment building between them. "I love you," the Duke said simply, the words carrying none of his usual careful formality, only raw, unguarded honesty. "I have loved you for weeks now, I think, though I did not allow myself to name it fully, until tonight, until I felt the terror of nearly losing you entirely. I do not care what obstacles convention places between us, Elena. I do not care what my cousin, or anyone else in this world might say about the difference in our stations. I only know that I cannot imagine this house, or my life, without you in it any longer." Elena felt tears rise, unbidden, at the raw sincerity of his confession. Everything she had felt building in her own heart for weeks, now finally finding an answering echo in his words. She opened her mouth to respond, to finally speak the feelings she had carried, carefully guarded since that first quiet evening in the study, when he had spoken her name in the firelight. But before she could find the words, a sharp, urgent voice called out from the darkness behind them, shattering the fragile intimacy of the moment entirely. "Your Grace," one of the fire brigade officers hurried toward them, his expression grim. "We have found something in the ruins of the records room, sir. Something that suggests this fire may not have started by accident at all." The words landed like a blow, and Elena felt the warmth of the moment they had just shared curdle instantly into cold dread. The Duke's expression hardened, the raw tenderness that had softened his features moments before, replaced entirely by the sharp, controlled fury she had seen once before, the night he had confronted Whitfield with the evidence of his theft. "Show me," he said, his voice clipped and tight. They followed the officer back through the smoke-damaged corridors, careful now to avoid the sections still deemed unsafe by the fire brigade's assessment. Until they reached the ruined shell of the records room itself, the officer knelt near the base of the wall closest to where the fire seemed to have originated, pointing to a scorched patch of floor where the burn pattern differed noticeably from the rest of the room. "This is where the fire began, Your Grace," the officer explained, his voice grave. "And here, you can see the remains of what appears to have been an oil-soaked rag, deliberately placed near a stack of paper and kindling. Fires that begin naturally, from a dropped candle or an untended hearth, do not typically show this kind of concentrated point of origin, nor this particular pattern of accelerant. I have seen enough deliberately set fires in my years with the brigade to recognize the signs clearly. This was no accident, sir. Someone set this fire intentionally." Elena's mind raced immediately to the same conclusion she could see forming behind the Duke's darkening expression. The timing was too precise, too convenient, coming mere hours after Lady Priscilla's furious departure from the manor, coming just as the household had begun to celebrate its successful defense against her earlier scheme, involving the missing petty cash funds, and the records room itself, containing the very ledgers that had proven both Whitfield's theft and the estate's subsequent recovery, represented exactly the kind of target someone desperate to discredit the household, or desperate to destroy evidence of their own wrongdoing, might choose to attack. "Priscilla," the Duke said quietly, the name coming out like a curse. "She would not simply accept defeat and depart without one final attempt at revenge. I should have anticipated this." "You cannot have known she would go so far," Elena said, though her own heart pounded with a mixture of fear and fury at the realization of exactly how close they had come to losing, far more than mere records that night, how close the falling beam had come to costing far more than either of them wanted to consider fully. Setting a fire in an occupied house, endangering the lives of everyone within it, that is no longer simply scheming or manipulation, Your Grace. That is attempted murder. The Duke's face had gone pale beneath the soot still streaking his features, the full weight of what his cousin might have been willing to risk settling over him with visible horror. "I need proof," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Suspicion alone will not be enough to bring proper charges against her, particularly given her standing within the family and the wider society that connects our households. But I will find that proof, Elena, whatever it takes, and I will ensure she answers fully for what she has done tonight." The investigation that followed moved with an urgency far exceeding even the careful work that had uncovered Whitfield's theft months before. The Duke dispatched inquiries to the village, where Lady Priscilla had taken lodging following her departure from the manor, seeking any information about her movements in the hours before the fire had been discovered. Meanwhile, Elena worked alongside the fire brigade officers and the household's remaining staff, carefully documenting every detail of the scene, every scrap of evidence that might help establish, beyond reasonable doubt, exactly who was responsible for the night's near catastrophe. It was Charlotte, once again proving herself an unexpectedly crucial witness, who provided the breakthrough they needed. She came forward the following morning, pale and shaken, to report that she had seen a figure moving near the east wing shortly before the fire's discovery, a figure she had initially dismissed as one of the household staff going about their evening duties, but whose build and manner, upon further reflection, matched not any servant she recognized, but rather the lady's maid, who had already been implicated in the earlier scheme involving the missing funds. She must have returned to the grounds after Lady Priscilla's departure, Elena realized, piecing together the timeline with growing horror, perhaps under instruction to complete one final act of sabotage before fully severing her connection to this household. The maid, when finally located and questioned by the local magistrate summoned specifically for the purpose, proved far less resilient under pressure than she had during the earlier confrontation regarding the missing funds. Faced with the mounting evidence, the fire brigade's clear assessment of deliberate arson, and the very real threat of severe legal consequences for endangering an entire household, she broke down entirely, confessing not only to setting the fire under Lady Priscilla's direct instruction, but revealing a letter, hastily concealed among her own belongings, in which Lady Priscilla had explicitly outlined her intention to destroy the estate's records, and, if possible, ensure the blame for the resulting chaos fell squarely upon Elena's shoulders. The letter, once recovered and verified, left no room for doubt regarding Lady Priscilla's culpability. not merely for the scheme involving the missing funds, but for the far graver crime of arson committed against an occupied household, an act that had come perilously close to costing Elena her life beneath that falling beam, and which could easily have claimed other lives among the household staff as well, had the fire spread even slightly differently through the old wooden structure of the East Wing. "She will answer for this before the full weight of the law," the Duke said grimly, once the evidence had been fully gathered and forwarded to the proper authorities for formal prosecution. "Whatever family loyalty I once felt toward my cousin has been entirely extinguished by what she was willing to risk last night, the lives she was willing to endanger, simply to satisfy her own wounded pride and ambition." Elena said nothing in response, still processing the full weight of how close they had both come to disaster, how the fragile, hopeful confession the Duke had offered her in the aftermath of the fire had so nearly been cut short entirely by Lady Priscilla's desperate act of revenge. But as the days passed, and the immediate crisis of the investigation finally settled into the slower, more formal process of legal proceedings against both Lady Priscilla and her maid, Elena found her thoughts returning, again and again, to the words the Duke had spoken to her, in the smoke-stained darkness outside the manor's entrance, words that remained, despite everything, still hanging unanswered between them, waiting for the right moment to finally be given the full response they deserved. The weeks that followed the fire brought a strange, uneasy calm to Ashworth Manor, the household slowly returning to its ordinary rhythms, even as the formal legal proceedings against Lady Priscilla ground forward with the particular slowness of matters involving the nobility. Elena found herself called upon repeatedly to provide testimony regarding the events of that terrible night, the fire brigade's findings, the discovery of the incriminating letter, each retelling requiring her to relive the fear of the falling beam and the desperate scramble through smoke-choked corridors, though she found the memory grew easier to bear each time she recounted it, perhaps because the Duke remained steadily by her side throughout the entire ordeal. The magistrate assigned to the case proved thorough and unhurried in his investigation, gathering testimony not only from Elena and the Duke, but from the maid who had confessed to setting the fire, from Charlotte and other household staff who had witnessed various pieces of the unfolding scheme, and eventually from Lady Priscilla herself, summoned to answer formally for the accusations mounting steadily against her. Elena attended the formal hearing at the magistrate's request, seated in the modest courtroom alongside the Duke, as Lady Priscilla was brought before the assembled officials to answer for her actions. The lady's usual polished confidence had faded considerably in the weeks since her departure from the manor, her face pale and drawn as the magistrate methodically laid out the evidence against her, the confession of her maid, the recovered letter detailing her intentions, the timeline that placed her firmly in the vicinity of the manor at the precise hour the fire had been set. "I never intended for anyone to be harmed," Lady Priscilla said, her voice carrying a desperate edge Elena had never heard from her before, so different from the cold, calculating tone she had used during her earlier schemes. "The fire was meant only to destroy the records, to create enough chaos and confusion that certain unfavorable arrangements might be reconsidered. I did not know anyone would be inside the room when it was set. I would never have wished for Elena, or my cousin, to come to any harm. Intention matters little when weighed against consequence, my lady," the magistrate said, his voice stern and unyielding. "You conspired to commit arson against an occupied household, endangering the lives of everyone within its walls, all in service of a scheme born from wounded pride and thwarted ambition. The law does not offer leniency, simply because the worst possible outcome was, by fortune, rather than by your own restraint, ultimately avoided." The proceedings concluded with a formal judgment against Lady Priscilla, one that stripped her of much of her remaining independence and standing within the family, requiring restitution for the damage caused to the manor, and mandating a period of supervised residence far from Ashworth lands, effectively exiling her from the social circles she had once moved through with such confident authority. Her maid, having cooperated fully with the investigation once confronted with the evidence, received a somewhat lighter sentence, though one that nonetheless marked the definitive end of her employment and reputation within the region. As the hearing concluded and the courtroom began to empty, Elena caught Lady Priscilla's eye one final time and found, to her surprise, not the cold defiance she had expected, but something closer to genuine, weary regret. The lady said nothing, offering only a brief, almost imperceptible nod, before she was led from the room by the officials tasked with overseeing her sentence. And Elena felt, despite everything the woman had put her through, a small, unexpected flicker of sympathy for someone whose ambitions had ultimately cost her everything she had once valued so highly. "It is finished," the Duke said quietly, as they walked together from the courthouse into the pale winter sunlight outside, the ordeal of the past weeks finally reaching its formal conclusion. "Whatever threat my cousin represented to this household, to you, it has been fully answered by the law. We are, at last, free of it entirely. I confess I feel little satisfaction in it," Elena admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of the admission. "Only relief, and perhaps a strange sadness, for a woman who might have found happiness through far different choices than the ones that led her here. That is a kindness I do not think I could extend so easily myself," the Duke said, though his voice carried more thoughtfulness than judgment. "But it is, perhaps, precisely the kind of grace that has made you who you are, Elena, the kind of person capable of extending genuine compassion, even to those who have wronged you most deeply." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the past week's ordeal finally beginning to lift from both their shoulders as the manor came into view ahead of them, its damaged east wing already undergoing the careful repairs the Duke had commissioned immediately following the fire brigade's assessment. Elena found her thoughts drifting back, inevitably, to the confession the Duke had offered her in the smoke-stained darkness outside the manor's entrance. Words that had remained carefully unaddressed in the weeks since, both of them too consumed by the aftermath of the fire and the subsequent investigation to properly return to the vulnerable intimacy of that interrupted moment. "Your Grace," she began carefully, as they reached the manor's entrance, "there is something we left unfinished, the night of the fire. Something I have thought of often in the weeks since, even amid everything else demanding our attention." The Duke's expression shifted immediately, understanding dawning in his eyes, alongside a flicker of the same vulnerable hope she had glimpsed that terrible, wonderful night. "I remember it clearly, Elena," he said quietly. "Every word of it, though I confess I have wondered, given everything that followed, whether the moment had passed entirely, whether the fear and chaos of that night had perhaps overshadowed feelings that might otherwise have felt too hastily spoken." "It did not overshadow them," Elena said softly, meeting his gaze steadily, despite the way her heart raced, with the significance of what she was finally ready to say. "If anything, everything that has happened since, the investigation, the hearing, watching you stand beside me through all of it, with such unwavering support, it has only made those feelings grow stronger, more certain, than I believe I could have fully understood on that first night alone." The Duke's breath caught visibly, and Elena watched hope bloom fully across his features, replacing the careful, guarded uncertainty he had carried since that interrupted confession weeks before. "Then tell me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, though the winter air around them seemed to hold its breath along with him. "Tell me plainly, Elena, so there can be no doubt left between us." "I love you," Elena said, the words coming easily now, freed finally from the careful walls she had maintained since that first cold morning, when debt collectors had knocked upon her father's shop door. "I have loved you for weeks now, perhaps longer than I allowed myself to fully admit, even to my own heart. Whatever obstacles still stand between a duke and a servant working off her family's debt, I find I no longer care to let them govern what I feel for you, Sebastian." His name, spoken freely and without hesitation for the very first time, seemed to settle something profound between them, the last careful distance finally dissolving entirely as the Duke closed the remaining space and gathered her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that carried none of the desperate fear of that fire-ravaged night, only the quiet, certain joy of a confession finally, fully answered. "Elena," he murmured against her hair, "you have given me back a life I thought I had lost entirely the day my father died and left me alone, with nothing but duty and grief to guide me. I do not intend to ever let you go again, whatever obstacles the world might still choose to place before us." They stood together for a long moment in the pale winter sunlight before the manor's entrance, the ruined east wing still bearing witness to how close they had come to losing this fragile, hard-won happiness entirely, but the warmth between them now steady and certain, unshakable in a way it had never quite dared to be before. Elena knew, even as she allowed herself to simply exist within the comfort of his embrace, that significant challenges still remained ahead of them, questions of station and propriety that would not resolve themselves simply because two hearts had finally found the courage to speak honestly. But for the first time since arriving at Ashworth Manor so many months before, she found she was no longer afraid of whatever challenges the future might still hold, certain now, at last, that whatever came, she would not face it alone. News of their understanding, once it finally became known throughout the household, spread with a speed that might have alarmed Elena in earlier months, but which now brought her only a quiet, steady happiness. Charlotte was, predictably, the first to offer her enthusiastic congratulations, embracing Elena warmly in the linen room, with a delight that suggested she had suspected the growing affection between her mistress and the Duke for far longer than either of them had realized. "I knew it," Charlotte declared, practically vibrating with excitement. "From the very first week, when he began summoning you to the study for the smallest of reasons. I told Mrs. Bellamy as much, though she insisted I was imagining things." "I insisted no such thing," Mrs. Bellamy corrected dryly, though the warmth in her eyes as she regarded Elena suggested she was every bit as pleased by the development as the younger maid. "I simply advised caution, given the complications such an attachment might bring. It seems, however, that caution has given way to something rather more promising." She reached out and squeezed Elena's hand with unexpected affection. "I am glad for you, girl, truly. You have earned whatever happiness comes your way, after everything this household has put you through since your arrival." The Duke, for his part, wasted little time in addressing the practical matters that still stood between their newfound understanding and any more formal arrangement. He summoned Elena to the study one evening, not long after the confession outside the manor's entrance. A stack of legal documents spread carefully across his desk. "I have had my solicitor review the original terms of your family's debt," he explained, "taking into account everything we uncovered regarding Whitfield's manipulation of the original arrangement. The true sum owed, once the inflated interest and falsified charges are properly removed, amounts to considerably less than what you have already worked to repay through your months of service here." Elena stared at the documents in surprise. "Are you saying the debt is already settled?" "More than settled," the Duke confirmed, a small, satisfied smile touching his lips. "Your family's shop will be returned to you immediately, free and clear of any remaining obligation, along with a sum in recompense for the unfair terms Whitfield's greed imposed upon your father in the first place. This is not charity, Elena, nor is it connected in any way to the understanding that has grown between us these past months. It is simply justice, long overdue, for a wrong that should never have been permitted to occur." The news brought tears to Elena's eyes, thoughts immediately turning to her mother and Peter, to the shop that held every memory of her father, now finally restored to her family without the shadow of debt hanging over it any longer. "Thank you," she said softly. "I do not know how to properly express what this means to my family, after everything we have endured." "You need not thank me," the Duke said gently. "If anything, I remain in your debt, Elena, for uncovering a theft that might otherwise have continued indefinitely, for standing beside me through every difficulty this household has faced since, and for offering me a kind of honest companionship I did not believe myself capable of finding again after so many years of grief and isolation." Elena traveled to town the following week to share the news with her family personally, finding her mother's health continuing its slow but steady improvement. Color returned fully to her cheeks. Strength returned enough that she had begun assisting with small tasks around their modest lodgings once more. Peter, now taller still, and carrying himself with a new confidence that spoke to the security of finally having their family's future settled, embraced Elena so tightly, upon hearing the news, that she nearly lost her breath entirely. "The shop is truly ours again?" her mother asked, disbelief and hope mingling in her voice, as Elena laid out the documents confirming the debt's resolution. "Free of any further obligation?" "Free and clear," Elena confirmed, "and with funds enough to repair what has fallen into disrepair since father's passing, and to hire additional help so that you need not strain yourself before your health has fully recovered." Her mother's eyes filled with tears as she studied the documents, then lifted to search Elena's face with the particular sharpness of a mother who recognized more was happening in her daughter's life than the mere resolution of a debt. "And the Duke," she said carefully. "Your letters these past months have spoken of him with a warmth I did not expect, given how your service there began. Is there something more you wish to tell me, Elena? Elena felt her cheeks warm, though she did not shy away from the question. Some part of her, relieved to finally speak openly of the feelings she had carried, carefully guarded through so many letters home. There is, she admitted, though I confess I do not yet know precisely what shape it will take, given the differences in our stations. But yes, Mother, there is something more. Her mother studied her for a long moment, then reached out to take her hand, squeezing it with the same warmth and understanding that had carried Elena through every difficulty of her life since childhood. Then I trust your judgment, as I always have, she said simply. You have never been a foolish girl, Elena. Whatever hardships life has placed before you, if your heart has found something worth trusting in that grand house, I will not stand in the way of it, whatever complications society might still choose to raise. Elena returned to Ashworth Manor that evening, with a lightness in her heart she had not felt in years. The weight of her family's debt finally, truly lifted. The warmth of her mother's blessing, carrying her the entire distance back through the winter countryside. She found the Duke waiting for her at the manor's entrance, having apparently anticipated her return, and the smile that broke across his face at the sight of her, so different from the cold, severe expression that had greeted her on her very first day of service so many months before, told her everything she needed to know about how completely their relationship had transformed since that difficult beginning, and how much further still they might yet travel together, whatever challenges remained ahead. Spring arrived slowly at Ashworth Manor that year. The frost-covered gardens Elena had grown so familiar with over the winter months, gradually giving way to the first tender shoots of new growth. A transformation that seemed, in its own quiet way, to mirror everything that had changed within the household since her arrival, nearly a year before. The East Wing repairs had finally concluded, the records room restored to its former function, though Elena still felt a small shiver whenever her duties required her to pass through its doors. Memory of that terrible night, never entirely far from her thoughts, despite the months that had passed since. Word of the understanding between Elena and the Duke had, inevitably, spread beyond the household itself, reaching the wider circle of neighboring families and society connections that governed the region's social life. Not everyone received the news with the same warmth Charlotte and Mrs. Bellamy had shown. Elena caught whispered comments during rare occasions, when her duties brought her into contact with visiting guests, pointed remarks about ambitious servants and dukes who had, apparently, lost their proper sense of station in the aftermath of grief and scandal. Pay them no mind, the Duke told her firmly, on one such occasion, when a visiting matron's poorly disguised insult had left Elena's composure visibly shaken. Their opinions matter little to me, Elena, and they should matter little to you as well. I care nothing for the judgment of those who value bloodlines over character, connections over genuine worth. It is easier for you to dismiss such judgment, Elena said quietly, once they were alone in the study that evening, the weight of the day's small cruelties still pressing on her despite his reassurance. You have never had to prove your worth to anyone, Your Grace. Your title alone secures you a place in every room you enter. I have spent this entire year proving myself capable, trustworthy, worthy of respect. And still, there are those who look at me and see only a seamstress who overstepped her station. The Duke's expression softened with genuine understanding, though Elena could see the words had struck something deeper in him as well. You are right, he admitted. I have never known what it is to have my worth questioned so openly, so cruelly. Simply because of circumstances of birth, I had no control over. I am sorry, Elena, for not fully appreciating the particular burden that places upon you, even as our understanding has grown between us. I do not say it to seek an apology, Elena said, softening slightly at his genuine remorse. Only to be honest about the challenges that still remain ahead of us, whatever certainty we have found in our own feelings for each other. It was around this same time, as the year of Elena's service approached its official conclusion, that the Duke raised a matter he had clearly been considering carefully for some time. He summoned her to the study one evening, his manner unusually formal, though Elena noticed a nervous energy beneath his careful composure that she had rarely observed in him before. Your year of service concludes in a fortnight, he said, once she had settled into the chair across from his desk. The original terms of our arrangement, even setting aside the correction to your family's debt, will be fully satisfied. You will be free, Elena, to return to your family, to your father's shop, to whatever life you choose to build for yourself. entirely unburdened by any further obligation to this household. Elena's heart clenched at the words, uncertain, for a moment, exactly what he intended by raising the matter so formally. "Is that what you wish for me to do?" she asked carefully. "No," the Duke said immediately, the single word carrying more raw honesty than any lengthy explanation might have offered. "That is precisely what I do not wish, Elena. But I find myself uncertain how to ask what I truly want, given everything that stands between us, given the very real challenges society will continue to raise against any more permanent arrangement between a duke and the seamstress who once worked in his household to settle her family's debt." He rose from his desk and moved to stand before the window, his back to her, and Elena recognized, in the tension of his shoulders, the same vulnerability she had glimpsed that first night he had spoken of his father's portrait. Grief and uncertainty laid bare beneath his usual careful control. "I have spent this entire year watching you prove, again and again, a strength and integrity that few in my own circle could hope to match," he continued. "I have watched you uncover a theft that nearly ruined this estate, defend yourself against schemes designed to destroy your reputation, risk your own life to save records that mattered to this household's future, and through it all, maintain a quiet dignity that has taught me more about true nobility than any lesson my father's careful instruction ever managed to impart." He turned to face her finally, something fierce and determined replacing the earlier uncertainty in his expression. "I do not wish for you to leave this house at the end of your service, Elena. I wish for you to remain here permanently, not as a servant working off a debt, but as my wife, if you will have me, whatever obstacles society chooses to raise against such a match." The words landed with a weight that left Elena momentarily speechless, hope and fear tangling together in her chest as she processed the full significance of what he was asking. She thought immediately of Lady Priscilla's cold warnings from so many months before, of the whispered insults from visiting guests, of everything a marriage between a duke and a former seamstress would face, from a society that valued bloodlines and connections above genuine character. "Sebastian," she said, using his given name to steady herself against the enormity of the moment, "you understand what such a marriage would cost you, socially, politically, your standing, your family's reputation, connections that matter for this estate's continued security. I do not wish to be the cause of difficulties that might undermine everything you have worked so hard to rebuild this past year. Do you love me?" the Duke asked simply, cutting through her careful practical concerns with a directness that left no room for evasion. "You know that I do," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then let me worry about society's judgment," he said, closing the distance between them and taking her hands in his, with a gentle certainty that steadied her racing heart considerably. "I have spent my entire life dutifully protecting this family's reputation, this estate's standing, at the cost of my own happiness, my own genuine connection with anyone beyond the careful, calculated relationships my station demanded of me. I am done sacrificing my heart for the sake of appearances, Elena. Whatever difficulties our marriage brings, I would rather face them beside you than spend the rest of my life comfortable and respected, but entirely alone." Elena felt tears rise, unbidden, at the raw sincerity of his declaration. Everything she had carefully guarded against, since that first cold morning, when debt collectors had knocked upon her father's shop door, finally dissolving entirely in the face of such genuine, unwavering devotion. "Then yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion despite the smile breaking across her face. "Yes, Sebastian, I will marry you, whatever challenges society chooses to raise against us." The Duke's expression transformed entirely at her answer, joy replacing the careful uncertainty he had carried into the conversation, and he pulled her close, holding her with a tenderness that spoke of everything they had endured together over the past year, to finally reach this moment. The theft uncovered, the schemes defeated, the fire survived, the debt resolved, and now, at last, a future finally within reach that neither of them had dared to fully imagine when Elena had first walked through the manor's imposing gates so many months before, armed with nothing but a folded paper and a fierce determination to protect her family, however uncertain the cost. But even as they stood together in the warm glow of the study's fireplace, celebrating a future finally secured, Elena could not entirely shake a small, persistent thread of worry regarding one particular matter that still remained unresolved between them: A small rebellion she had carried since her very first days of service. One that felt, suddenly, far more significant than she had ever imagined it might become. The Duke seemed to notice her distraction, pulling back slightly to study her face with gentle concern. "What troubles you?" he asked. "You have just agreed to marry me, and yet something still weighs on your thoughts." Elena hesitated, uncertain how to explain the strange, stubborn habit she had carried through nearly the entire year of her service. "Do you remember," she said finally, "the very first week I arrived here, when you demanded I address you properly, as Your Grace, and nothing else?" "I remember," the Duke said, a faint smile touching his lips at the memory. "I also remember, quite clearly, how thoroughly you avoided doing so, whenever you could manage it. Constructing entire sentences, simply to escape speaking the title, or my name, directly to my face." "You noticed that," Elena said, surprised, though she supposed she should not have been, given how closely he seemed to have observed her from the very beginning. "Of course I noticed," the Duke said, his smile widening. "It was, I confess, one of the very first things that drew my attention to you, Elena. Every other servant in this household falls over themselves to use my title as often as possible, eager to demonstrate proper deference. You alone seemed determined to avoid speaking to me directly at all, whenever propriety allowed it. It was maddening, and utterly fascinating, in equal measure. It began as simple defiance," Elena admitted, a rueful smile touching her own lips at the memory of that first stubborn vow she had made to herself. "I could not refuse the debt, could not refuse the arrangement you demanded of me, but I could refuse to give you the satisfaction of hearing warmth in my voice when I addressed you. It felt, at the time, like the only power I had left to claim as entirely my own. And now?" the Duke asked softly, searching her face with genuine curiosity. "Even now, Elena, in private moments such as this one, I notice you still favor my given name over any formal title, but I have never once heard you address me by name before the household, before guests, before anyone beyond these private conversations we share. Is that habit, too, still some quiet act of defiance you have not yet released?" Elena considered the question carefully, surprised to find real truth in his observation. She had, indeed, continued the habit longer than she consciously realized, offering warmth and his given name freely in private, but retreating always to careful formality, to "Your Grace," or elaborate sentence constructions that avoided direct address entirely, whenever others were present to hear. It had become such an ingrained habit over the year that she had not fully noticed how deliberately she still maintained the distinction. "I suppose it has become something else entirely," she said slowly, working through the realization even as she spoke it aloud. "Not defiance any longer, not truly. Perhaps simply caution, a way of protecting something precious and private from a world that has not always been kind to what has grown between us. Speaking your name freely before others would mean claiming this, claiming you, entirely and publicly, without the careful distance that has protected me, in some small way, from the judgment and cruelty we have already faced." "Then perhaps," the Duke said gently, lifting her chin with a tender finger so their eyes met fully, "when you are finally ready to claim it fully, to speak my name freely, before the entire world rather than only in the privacy of these stolen moments, it will mean something far more significant than simple habit or defiance ever could. It will mean you have chosen this, chosen us, entirely and without reservation, whatever the world's judgment might still bring against it." Elena felt the truth of his words settle deeply into her heart, understanding, for the first time, exactly what that small, stubborn habit had truly represented across the long months of her service, and exactly what finally releasing it, publicly and completely, would come to mean. "Then I will know when the moment is right," she said softly. "And when it comes, Sebastian, I promise you, the whole world will hear it." The Duke's smile at her words carried a warmth that seemed to banish every lingering shadow of doubt or fear that had accompanied their long, difficult year together. And as they stood together in the study's firelight, their engagement now formally settled between them, Elena felt, for the first time since her father's death, had first upended her life so completely. A genuine, unshakable certainty about the future, finally stretching out ahead of her, bright and full of promise, despite whatever challenges still remained for them to face together in the days and weeks ahead. News of the engagement, once formally announced, spread through the region with a speed that rivaled even the fire's destructive path through the manor's east wing months before. The Duke insisted on a proper announcement, unwilling to let rumor or careless gossip shape the narrative of their union before he had the chance to declare it himself, openly and with full confidence, before the assembled society of the region. He arranged a formal gathering at the manor, inviting not only the neighboring noble families who had long formed the household's social circle, but also, at Elena's own request, her mother and Peter, whose presence at such a grand occasion would have been unthinkable only a year before, when Elena had first walked through the manor's gates, as nothing more than a debtor's daughter sent to work off a family obligation. "Are you certain you wish to do this so publicly?" Elena asked, the morning of the gathering, as Charlotte helped her dress in a gown finer than anything she had ever worn before, a gift from the Duke that had arrived a week earlier, with a note simply reading, "For the woman who has already proven herself worthy of any title this world might offer." "I have never been more certain of anything," the Duke said, appearing in the doorway of her chamber with an expression of steady, unwavering confidence. "Let them see us together, Elena. Let them understand, from the very outset, that this union is not some scandal to be whispered about in corners, but a match I am proud to claim before the entire world." The great hall, decorated with early spring blooms, gathered from the gardens Elena had watched slowly bloom back to life over the preceding weeks, filled steadily through the afternoon with guests, whose reactions to the news ranged from genuine warmth to poorly disguised disdain. Elena kept her composure through each introduction, each carefully worded congratulation that carried undertones of judgment beneath its surface politeness, grateful for the Duke's steady presence beside her throughout the ordeal, his hand finding hers whenever the weight of society's scrutiny threatened to become too heavy to bear alone. Her mother, seated in a place of honor near the front of the gathered guests, watched the proceedings with an expression of quiet, fierce pride that steadied Elena more than any other single thing that afternoon. Peter, dressed in new clothes the Duke had insisted on providing for the occasion, stood tall and confident beside their mother, no longer the frightened boy who had watched debt collectors knock upon their shop door, but a young man who had witnessed, over the past year, exactly what his sister's courage and integrity could accomplish against even the steepest odds. It was during a quiet moment, amid the gathering's formal proceedings, as the Duke prepared to address the assembled guests directly regarding their engagement, that Elena felt the full weight of everything the past year had brought her. Every hardship and triumph woven together into a single, momentous afternoon that would mark the true conclusion of the journey that had begun so painfully on that cold morning, nearly 12 months before. "Friends," the Duke began, his voice carrying easily across the hushed hall, "many of you have known this family for generations, have watched this estate weather difficulties both public and private over the years since my father's passing. I wish to gather you all here today, not merely to announce my engagement, but to speak plainly about the woman I have chosen to share my life with, and about the extraordinary courage and character that led me to this decision." He turned to look at Elena directly, and she felt every eye in the room follow his gaze, the weight of their collective scrutiny settling over her like a physical thing, though she found, standing beside him, that she no longer feared it the way she once might have. "Elena Marsh came to this household under circumstances neither of us would have chosen," the Duke continued, "burdened by a debt inherited unfairly from a father who deserved better than the manipulations of a dishonest steward. She could have arrived here bitter, resentful, resigned to simple servitude. Instead, she arrived with a fierce dignity that refused to bow entirely, even when I demanded, in my own foolish pride, that she address me only by my title, nothing more." A soft ripple of surprised laughter moved through the gathered guests at this admission, and Elena felt her own lips curve into an unexpected smile, despite the formality of the occasion. She uncovered a theft that had bled this estate for nearly a decade, a theft that might have continued indefinitely, without her sharp eye, and her willingness to speak difficult truths to a Duke unaccustomed to hearing them, the Duke continued, his voice growing steadily warmer as he spoke. She defended herself against schemes designed to destroy her reputation, risked her own life to save records that mattered to this household's future, and through every difficulty this past year has brought, she has shown a strength and integrity that I have come to value beyond anything my title or this estate's wealth could ever offer me in return." He paused, and Elena felt her heart pound as he reached for her hand, his eyes never leaving hers, even as he continued addressing the assembled crowd. "I know there are those among you who question this match, who believe a duke's proper place lies only with those of equal station and connection. I understand such concerns, even as I reject them entirely. I have spent this past year learning that true worth has nothing to do with the circumstances of one's birth, and everything to do with the character one demonstrates when circumstances demand the greatest courage. Elena has demonstrated that courage again and again, and I consider myself fortunate beyond measure that she has chosen to share her life with mine." The hall fell into a charged silence as he finished speaking, and Elena felt the full weight of the moment settle over her, understanding, with sudden clarity, that this was exactly the moment she had spoken of weeks before, in the privacy of the study, the moment when claiming this love publicly, completely, would carry a significance beyond anything she had experienced in the quiet, private confessions they had shared until now. She stepped forward, releasing his hand only long enough to face the assembled guests directly, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart as she spoke, for the very first time, before the entire gathered world, the name she had carried, carefully guarded in private, for so many months of stubborn, quiet rebellion. "A year ago," she said, "I stood in this very house, and was told I would address its master only as Your Grace, nothing more, nothing warmer. I made a private vow that day, one I kept faithfully, for nearly the entire year that followed, refusing to speak his name aloud, refusing to offer warmth I did not believe he had earned, however dutifully I performed the tasks required of me." She turned to look at the Duke directly, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she continued, "I do not regret that stubborn silence, difficult as it was to maintain. It protected something in me that needed protecting, during a time when I had very little else that felt entirely my own. But I find, standing here today, that I no longer wish to protect that silence any further. I no longer wish to hold back what I feel, out of caution or fear of a world that may judge us harshly for choosing each other, despite every convention that suggests we should not." She turned fully to face him now, her hand finding his once more, and spoke the words that would mark the true conclusion of the long, difficult journey that had begun, on that cold morning, when debt collectors had first knocked upon her father's shop door. "Sebastian," she said, his name finally spoken freely, publicly, completely, carrying none of the careful distance she had maintained for so long, only the full, unguarded warmth of everything she had come to feel for him, across their extraordinary year together. "I love you, entirely and without reservation, and I am proud, before everyone gathered here today, to claim that love openly, whatever judgment the world still chooses to offer against it." The hall erupted into a mixture of surprised murmurs and genuine, warm applause, the Duke's answering smile so full of joy that Elena felt any lingering doubt about the wisdom of speaking so openly dissolve entirely in the face of it. He pulled her close, heedless of the assembled audience, and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead that drew a fresh wave of approving murmurs from the more sympathetic members of the crowd. "You kept me waiting a full year for that," he murmured against her hair, low enough that only she could hear it. "But I confess, Elena, it was worth every moment of patience to finally hear my name from your lips before the entire world." "Some things," Elena said softly, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes, "are worth waiting for properly, rather than rushing simply for the sake of convenience." The gathering continued long into the evening, the initial shock of the public declaration gradually giving way to genuine celebration, as more and more of the assembled guests, swayed by the evident sincerity of the match and the Duke's clear, unwavering devotion, offered their sincere congratulations, rather than the careful, judgmental politeness that had marked the afternoon's earlier hours. Elena's mother embraced her tightly during a quiet moment away from the crowd, tears of joy streaming freely down her face, while Peter beamed with obvious pride at his sister's transformation, from frightened debtor's daughter to the future mistress of one of the region's most respected estates. As the celebration finally began winding down into the late evening hours, Elena found herself standing once more in the same kitchen garden, where Sebastian had first spoken openly of his feelings for her, the frost-covered hedges of that winter night, now replaced by the fresh, fragrant blooms of early spring. He joined her there, quiet and content, wrapping his arms around her from behind as they looked out together over the grounds that would, before long, become fully and completely her home as well. "A year ago," she said softly, echoing her earlier words to the assembled guests. "I could not have imagined standing here, in this place, feeling what I feel now. I arrived at these gates believing I had lost everything that mattered to me. My father's shop, my family's security, perhaps even my own sense of who I was, beyond simple survival." "And what do you believe now?" Sebastian asked gently, his voice warm against her ear. "Now," Elena said, turning in his arms to face him fully, "I believe that sometimes the hardest beginnings lead to the most unexpected, most precious endings. I believe that dignity is not measured by the title one holds, but by the courage one shows when circumstances demand it most. And I believe, entirely and without reservation, that I have found in you, not the cold, imperious duke I once feared, but a partner whose heart matches my own, in every way that truly matters." Sebastian's smile at her words carried the full weight of everything they had endured together to reach this moment, every hardship and triumph of the past year distilled into a single, perfect understanding between two people who had found, against every expectation and every obstacle society had raised before them, a love worth claiming fully and completely, whatever the future might still bring. "Then let us build that future together," he said softly, "starting now, and continuing for every day that follows, for as long as we both shall live." Elena smiled, rising on her toes to press a gentle kiss to his lips, sealing the promise between them beneath the fragrant blooms of the spring garden. The long, difficult year of silence and careful distance, finally, completely behind them, replaced at last by a love spoken freely, openly, and without a single trace of the reservation that had once kept them so carefully, stubbornly apart. The wedding took place that summer, in the same great hall where Sebastian had first announced their engagement before the assembled society of the region, though this time, the gathered guests included far fewer skeptics and far more genuine well-wishers, many of them won over entirely by the evident devotion between the couple in the months since their engagement had first been made public. Elena's mother, her health fully restored by then, stood proudly among the guests, while Peter, now formally taken on as an apprentice within the estate's growing administrative offices at Sebastian's personal invitation, beamed with undisguised pride throughout the entire ceremony. Mrs. Bellamy oversaw the wedding preparations with the same brisk efficiency she brought to every household matter, though Elena caught the older woman wiping away unexpected tears more than once during the ceremony itself, while Charlotte, unable to contain her excitement, had spent the preceding weeks recounting to anyone who would listen the full story of how she had known, from the very first week, that something extraordinary was growing between the new seamstress and their previously cold, unreachable master. Elena's father's shop, fully restored and expanded with the resources the corrected debt settlement had provided, continued operating under her mother's careful management, staffed now by several young women Elena had personally recommended. Girls from the town who might otherwise have struggled to find honest, well-paying work. A small but meaningful way of extending the same fairness and opportunity that had ultimately transformed her own life so completely. As for Duke Sebastian Ashworth, the household he governed transformed steadily in the years that followed, growing into a place known throughout the region, not for cold formality or rigid hierarchy, but for genuine warmth, fair dealing, and the kind of steady, principled leadership that Elena's influence had helped cultivate in a man who had once believed such openness was a luxury his position could not afford. Together, they rebuilt not only the estate's finances and its damaged east wing, but something far more valuable, a household and a marriage, built on honesty rather than obligation, on genuine respect rather than mere duty. Years later, when their own children asked about the portrait that hung in the manor's East Wing gallery, depicting Elena in the very gown she had worn the day she finally spoke Sebastian's name before the assembled society of the region, she would tell them the story of a proud, stubborn young woman who had refused, for an entire year, to give a demanding duke the satisfaction of hearing warmth in her voice, and of the patient, unexpected love that had grown steadily between them despite that careful silence, until the day finally came when speaking his name aloud, freely and completely, felt not like surrender, but like the truest, most powerful choice she had ever made. Was it truly worth waiting an entire year? Her daughter asked once, studying the portrait with the particular curiosity of a child trying to understand a parent's younger self. Every single day of it, Elena told her, smiling at the memory of that cold, difficult beginning, and everything extraordinary it had ultimately grown into. Because when I finally did speak his name, your father understood, without any doubt at all, that I meant it with my whole heart, exactly as I have meant every single word I have spoken to him ever since. And so the story of the Duke who demanded a title, and the seamstress who withheld his name for an entire year, before finally, freely offering it, became a quiet legend within the household and the wider region alike, a reminder that the truest, most lasting kind of love is rarely the one offered easily or quickly, but the one earned patiently, honestly, and given, in the end, entirely and without reservation, exactly when the heart is finally, truly ready to offer it.